Venturing into forgotten spaces, the chilling stories of abandoned park structures are explored. An unsettling journey is undertaken into urban decay, where the echoes of past lives are deeply felt. My name is Ethan Vance. To the University Administration, I'm student number 778B41, a sophomore majoring in forestry. A field I chose out of a romantic notion that my life's work should be conducted under a canopy of green. To my parents, I am their only son, a source of perpetual, low-grade anxiety, whose latest questionable decision was to spend his fall break backpacking solo through the Appalachian Mountains. To myself, especially at that moment, I was a conqueror, an adventurer standing on the precipice of a wild, untamed world. I was, of course, profoundly naive. The trip had been meticulously planned for months, my dorm room floor often disappearing under a sea of topographical maps and gear lists. The target was the Rhone Highlands, a majestic and notoriously rugged stretch of the Appalachian Trail straddling the border between Tennessee and North Carolina. My professors had spoken of it with a kind of reverence, describing the unique grassy balds that crown the mountaintops, islands of prairie in a sea of dense forest. They were, I was told, ecological mysteries. No one is entirely sure why the trees don't grow there. I began my hike at Carver's Gap, the air crisp with the promise of late autumn. The first day was a grueling, but rewarding ascent through forests of skeletal birch and deep green spruce. The trail was a well-worn artery of packed earth and stone, and I passed a handful of other hikers. Grizzled, sinewy through hikers with thousand-mile stares and weekend warriors like myself, their faces flushed with exertion. At a trail shelter, I saw a faded flyer tacked to a wooden post. It showed the smiling, pixelated face of a young woman who had vanished somewhere in this vast wilderness 2 years prior. The notice was weathered, the ink bleeding from seasons of rain and sun, a quiet, persistent testament to the mountain's indifference. A park ranger I'd spoken to at the trailhead had given me the standard warnings. Watch the weather, secure your food. Don't wander off the marked path. These mountains are old, he'd said, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. They don't forgive foolishness. His words echoed in my mind as I made the decision to leave the Appalachian Trail on the second day. My map showed a smaller, unmarked spur trail that, according to my research, led to a more secluded and less visited bald. The allure of true isolation, of having a mountaintop entirely to myself, was too strong to resist. The path, if one could call it that, was barely there. A faint suggestion of passage through tangled rhododendron tunnels, known locally as laurel hells. The branches clawed at my pack and clothes, and for more than an hour, my world was nothing but a claustrophobic green-brown thicket. Then, abruptly, I burst out of the trees and onto the bald. The effect was breathtaking. It was a perfect dome of wild grass and low-lying shrubs sweeping upwards to a gentle summit. The sky, a vast and piercing blue, felt impossibly close. A sea of lesser peaks, hazy and blue tinted, rolled away in every direction. I had found it. My own private kingdom. I dropped my heavy pack onto the springy turf, a triumphant shout swallowed by the immense silence. I felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being the only human being for 100 miles. I set up my small, one-man tent in the center of the bald, a good distance from the tree line, which formed a dark, impenetrable wall around the clearing. As the sun began its descent, it painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty was so intense it felt almost sacred, holy. I made a small meal on my camp stove, the hiss of the burner the only man-made sound. Once darkness fell, it was absolute. There was no moon yet, and the stars were a brilliant, chaotic spill across the black velvet of the sky. It was then that I first noticed the quiet. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, watchful silence. In the forests below, there was always a chorus of insect life, the call of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. Here, there was nothing. The wind moved through the grass with a soft, sibilant whisper, but beyond that, the world seemed to be holding its breath. I zipped myself into my tent, telling myself the unnerving stillness was simply a feature of the high altitude. I slept, but it was a thin, restless sleep. I woke once, convinced I'd heard something, but the silence outside was as profound as ever. I chalked it up to the unfamiliar environment and drifted off again. The second night, the moon was a waxing crescent, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the landscape. The silver light made the clearing look alien, like the surface of another world. I fell asleep faster this time, exhausted from a day of exploring the summit. The dream I was having was mundane. Something about a missed exam, when a new sound slowly worked its way into my consciousness, pulling me toward the surface of wakefulness. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, rhythmic, and methodical. My first groggy thought was of a woodpecker, but it was the middle of the night. Then I thought perhaps it was a branch, tapping against a rock in the wind. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The sound was close, annoyingly close. Tap, tap, tap. A cold dread began to seep into my veins as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the woods around me. It wasn't coming from outside the tent at all. I held my breath, my heart starting a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. The sound was coming from underneath me. It was faint, muffled by my sleeping pad and the tent floor, but it was unmistakable. It sounded, impossibly, like a fingernail or a small stone tapping on a hard surface, tapping on rock. I was lying on at least a foot of topsoil and grass. There shouldn't be any rock directly beneath me. I tried to rationalize it. An animal, a mole or a shrew, digging. But the sound was too regular, too deliberate. It lacked the frantic, scrabbling quality of a burrowing creature. This was patient. This was intelligent. Tap, tap, tap. I slowly, carefully pushed myself up onto my elbows. The movement sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. The tapping stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow worse than the sound it replaced. It was heavy with expectation. I stayed frozen, every muscle tensed, listening with an intensity that bordered on pain. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Nothing. Just the whisper of the wind across the grass. I finally let out a shaky breath. It was a branch. It had to be. Maybe a root system settling, a stone shifting underground. Any explanation was better than the one my terrified imagination was starting to construct. I told myself I was being ridiculous. A city kid spooked by the unfamiliar sounds of the wild. I tried to lie back down, to force my body to relax. But my eyes were locked on the thin nylon floor of my tent, as if I could see through it to the cold, dark earth below. I was no longer a conqueror on my private mountaintop. I was a trespasser, and I had the distinct, chilling feeling that I had just knocked on a door I never should have approached. Sleep was no longer a possibility. It had been banished from my mind, replaced by a hyper-alert state of terror that was both exhausting and electrifying. I remained on my elbows for what felt like hours, my neck aching, my ears straining to catch the slightest sound beyond the mournful sigh of the wind. Every rustle of the tent fabric, every distant whisper of the breeze was magnified 1,000 times, filtered through a prism of pure fear. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me good grades and helped me navigate the complexities of university life, was desperately trying to reassert control. It was an animal. It was a geological shift. It was a dream. But the primal, ancient part of my brain, the part that understood the dark, knew better. It knew that the deliberate, rhythmic tapping was not a product of the natural world. I didn't dare move. My world had shrunk to the thin nylon floor of my tent. The vast, beautiful wilderness I had admired only hours before now felt like a cage, and I was trapped inside with something unknown. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. My fear began to curdle into a strange kind of resignation. I was going to die here, on this remote mountaintop, and no one would ever know what happened. The faded flyer of the missing girl flashed in my mind. Maybe she had heard the tapping, too. Just as a sliver of hope began to suggest that I had imagined the whole thing, a new sound began. It was far worse than the tapping. It was a low, grating, scraping noise. The sound of stone grinding against stone. It was slow, laborious, and filled with an immense sense of weight and effort. It came from the same direction as the tapping had, from beneath the earth, but it was not directly under me. It sounded like it was several yards away, closer to the edge of the clearing. Ape. The sound vibrated through the ground, a deep, resonant tremor that I felt in my bones. It was a sound so alien and out of place in this environment that it made the hair on my arms stand on end. There was no mistaking this for an animal. This was the sound of construction, or, more terrifyingly, of deconstruction. The sound of a tomb being opened. Guriand. Scrape. I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that I could not stay in the tent. To be caught in this flimsy shelter, a blind and helpless victim, was a fate more terrifying than facing whatever was making that noise. The thought of the ground beneath me, tearing open of a hand reaching up from the cold earth to grab my ankle, was enough to override my paralysis. I had to see. I had to know. Morbid curiosity, the same impulse that makes drivers slow down for a car crash, was now my master. Moving with agonizing slowness, I reached for the zipper on the tent door. The metallic tang of the pull tab was cold against my trembling fingers. I pulled it down, an inch at a time. The sound of the zipper teeth separating was like a scream in the profound silence, a declaration of my presence. I expected the scraping to stop, for whatever was out there to react to the noise. But it continued, indifferent and methodical, as if my existence was of no consequence. I crawled out of the tent into the cold night air. The crescent moon cast a pale, sickly light over the bald, bleaching the color from the grass and casting long, distorted shadows. I rose to my feet, my legs shaking so badly, I was surprised they held my weight. The cold immediately seeped through my socks and into my feet, but I barely noticed. My entire being was focused on the sound, which was louder now, and I could pinpoint its source. It was coming from the northern edge of the bald, about 50 feet from my tent. I stood frozen, a statue of terror, and watched. And then I saw it. A section of the turf, a near perfect circle of grass and earth, was moving. It was no bigger than a manhole cover, and it was being pushed upwards from below, tilting on an unseen hinge. The edges were unnervingly clean, as if the circle had been cut from the surrounding, sawed with a giant, precise blade. The scraping sound intensified as the slab of earth and stone lifted, grinding against the subterranean opening it had concealed. It came to rest at an angle, revealing a patch of absolute, impenetrable blackness beneath. An entrance. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast, silent arena of the mountaintop. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only watch the dark, circular hole in the world. Time seemed to stop. Then something emerged. First, a pale shape rose slowly from the darkness. A forehead, slick with grime and moisture. Then a face framed by a thick, matted beard that hung down like tangled roots, caked with soil and bits of grass. The skin was a ghostly, luminous white, a stark contrast to the filth that clung to it. It was the face of a man, but a man who had not seen the sun in 1,000 years. But it was the eyes that shattered my sanity. They were huge, perfectly round, and glowed with a faint, internal luminescence, like two small moons. They were a milky, opaque white, with no discernible iris or pupil. They blinked, a slow, deliberate motion, as if adjusting to the faint light of the world above. The head turned, and the moon, eyes scanned the clearing with a slow, ancient intelligence that was utterly inhuman. They swept across the landscape, past my tent, and for one heart-stopping, eternal second, they fixed on me. I was seen. The connection was electric, a jolt of pure, undiluted terror that shot through my entire nervous system. In those glowing, pupilless orbs, I saw a knowledge of the world that was deep, dark, and subterranean. I was an intruder, a fleeting surface, dwelling creature whose presence was an unexpected anomaly. The creature's expression, if it could be called that, did not change. There was no anger, no curiosity, just a calm, ancient appraisal. Then, as if startled not by me, but by its own exposure, the head retreated. It dropped back into the darkness with a surprising swiftness. The scraping, grinding sound returned as the circular slab of stone and earth was pulled back down, fitting into place with a final, dull thud that echoed in the silence. It was gone. The clearing was empty again. The wind whispered through the grass. The moon shone on an unbroken, peaceful landscape. If not for the faint, perfectly circular outline in the turf, I might have convinced myself it was all a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by altitude and isolation. But I knew what I had seen, and the truth that crashed down upon me was more terrifying than any monster. My professors had been wrong. This bald wasn't an ecological mystery. It was architecture. I hadn't pitched my tent in a clearing. I had pitched it on a roof. The entire mountaintop was a hollow, artificial structure, a lid on a world I couldn't begin to comprehend. The missing people, the unnerving silence, the legends of the mountains. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying reality. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a knot of pure panic. My meticulously planned backpacking trip was over. Survival was the only thing that mattered. The instinct to flee was so powerful, so absolute that it erased all other thoughts. I didn't think about my gear. I didn't think about the trail. I scrambled back to the tent, not even bothering with the zipper. I ripped at the mesh door, tearing a hole, and grabbed my backpack. It held my water, my car keys, my wallet. It was all I needed. I left the tent, the sleeping bag, the stove, all of it, a pathetic offering to the things that lived below. With my pack slung haphazardly over one shoulder, I ran. I didn't run toward the faint trail that had led me to this cursed place. I just ran for the opposite side of the clearing, for the dark, formidable wall of the spruce fir forest. I plunged into the trees, the branches whipping at my face and arms, their sharp needles like claws. The darkness of the forest was absolute, a welcome blindness after the terrible clarity of the moonlight on the bald. I ran blindly, stumbling over roots, crashing through undergrowth, driven by a terror so profound it had become my entire world. I did not look back. I would never look back. The forest swallowed me whole. One moment I was on the moonlit bald, the next I was in a suffocating, pitch black labyrinth of wood and leaves. Panic was a physical thing, a wild animal clawing at my throat, propelling me forward. I didn't run with any sense of direction. I simply ran away from the clearing on the roof of the world. Branches that were mere obstacles on my hike, and were now malicious arms that whipped at my face, tore at my clothes, and snagged my pack. The dense spruce fir needles scratched my skin, leaving fiery trails of pain. I stumbled over unseen roots, my ankles twisting, my knees slamming into the hard, unforgiving earth. Each fall sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. The fear of being pinned, of hearing something approaching from behind. I could hear nothing but my own ragged gasps for air and the frantic, percussive beat of my heart. The silence of the bald had been unnerving, but the noise of the forest was now a symphony of terror. Every snap of a twig was a footstep. Every rustle of leaves was a subterranean creature slithering through the undergrowth. The hoot of a distant owl sounded like a signal, a call echoing through the darkness, announcing the presence of the surface dweller. I imagined those luminous, moon-like eyes watching me from the shadows, their pale faces melting into the dappled darkness. Were they following me? Or did they not need to? Perhaps they were already ahead, waiting for me, rising from the earth in my path. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. But I didn't dare stop. To stop was to be caught. I ran until I physically couldn't anymore, until my legs tangled beneath me, and I pitched forward, crashing through a thicket of rhododendron and landing hard on a bed of damp leaves. I lay there, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably, every muscle screaming in protest. The adrenaline that had fueled my flight began to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a pain that was starting to register in sharp, specific points all over my body. For a long time, I just lay there, listening. The sounds of the forest slowly resolved back into what they were: the wind, the creak of tree limbs, the scuttling of some small, nocturnal animal. There was no sound of pursuit, no grinding of stone. The immediate threat seemed to have passed, but the knowledge of it remained, a poison that had contaminated the entire landscape. This wasn't a forest anymore. It was a graveyard, and I was trespassing. As my breathing quieted, a new fear began to creep in, a cold and rational dread that was almost worse than the blind panic. I was lost. I had run without a compass, without a thought trail, deep into a wilderness known for its unforgiving terrain. I had a backpack with a water bottle that was half empty, a wallet, and my car keys. No map. No shelter. I had fled one monster only to run into the arms of another, the slow, indifferent lethality of the mountains themselves. The night seemed endless. I huddled at the base of a massive oak, shivering, though the air wasn't particularly cold. It was a tremor that came from deep within, a physical manifestation of my shattered nerves. I thought about the creature's face, the pale, grimy skin, the root-like beard, and those terrible, glowing eyes. They weren't monsters of myth or legend. They were real. They were a species, a civilization that lived beneath the ground. The Cherokee legends of the region spoke of the Nunahi, the people who live anywhere. But they also told tales of the Sul-Kalu, a slant-eyed giant who lived in the mountains, and of the moon-eyed people, a race that could not see in the daylight and were driven underground. I had dismissed them as folklore, quaint stories to explain strange rock formations or unusual weather. Now I knew they were history, a history that was still very much alive. When the first hints of dawn finally began to filter through the dense canopy, it was like a divine reprieve. The gray light revealed the extent of my ordeal. My clothes were shredded. My arms and face were a crisscross of deep scratches, and a large, dark bruise was blooming on my leg. But the light also brought hope. With the sun, I could find my direction. I knew my car was parked to the west, and by following the sun's slow arc, I could, in theory, find my way back. The journey was a grueling, painful blur. I stumbled through the woods for hours, my thirst becoming a throbbing obsession. I followed the slope of the land downwards, reasoning that it would eventually lead to a stream. It did. I drank deeply from the ice-cold water, not caring about parasites or pollutants. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. Rejuvenated, I continued my trek, my mind a numb landscape of fear and exhaustion. It was late in the afternoon when I heard it. A sound so foreign and so beautiful that I thought I was hallucinating the distant, mechanical drone of a car engine. I broke into a stumbling run, crashing through the trees and undergrowth with a renewed sense of desperation. I emerged from the tree line and fell onto the hot, black asphalt of a 2-lane road. It was the road leading to Carver's Gap. I had made it. A few minutes later, a park ranger's truck pulled up beside me. The same ranger I had spoken to 2 days before. His eyes widened as he took in my appearance. "My God, son, what happened to you?" he asked, getting out of the truck. I tried to tell him. The words tumbled out of me in a chaotic, incoherent flood. The bald, it's a roof, they live underneath. The tapping, the eyes, the moon eyes. He listened patiently, his expression a mixture of concern and professional skepticism. He put a blanket around my shoulders and gave me a bottle of water from his cooler. "Easy now," he said in a calm, soothing voice. "You've had a rough time. It's not uncommon for folks to get turned around up here. Dehydration, exhaustion, it can make you see things." "No," I insisted, my voice cracking. "It was real. I left my tent, all my gear. You can go see it. You'll see the circle in the ground." He nodded slowly. "We'll send someone up to retrieve your gear. Don't you worry. Probably a bear got into your camp and gave you a good scare. Happens all the time." I stopped trying to explain. I could see in his eyes that he had already filed my story away under a neat, tidy label. An experienced hiker. Panicked. He would find my abandoned campsite and conclude that a bear had ransacked it, chasing me away in a delirious flight. He would see the faint circle on the bald and think it was a strange fungal ring or an old lightning strike. He would never know the truth. I was utterly, completely alone with my knowledge. I never went back to the mountains. I dropped out of the forestry program the following semester and changed my major to architecture, though I'm not sure why. Maybe it's a subconscious need to understand how things are built, to reassure myself of the solidity of the ground beneath my own feet. But the terror never really left. It's a low-grade hum beneath the surface of my everyday life. I don't go camping anymore. I avoid parks and large, open fields. Sometimes, at night, in the dead quiet of my apartment, I think I can hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the floor below. And I find myself staring at the ground, wondering what forgotten doors lie beneath the concrete and steel of the world we think we know, and praying they remain closed. My name is Caleb Thorne. For 20 years, I've worn the uniform of a National Park Service ranger in the Shenandoah. My boots have logged more miles on these trails than most people's cars have on pavement. The mountains are in my blood, a legacy passed down from my grandfather, helped build Skyline Drive. I know the slant of the sun through the oak leaves in autumn, the particular scent of wet slate after a summer storm, and the deep, resonant silence of a winter snowfall. Most importantly, I know the sounds. I can distinguish the sharp, panicked cry of a rabbit caught by a hawk from the playful yip of a young fox. I can tell you if the rustle in the undergrowth is a white-tailed deer browsing or a black bear foraging for grubs. The forest speaks a language, and for 2 decades, I've been its diligent student. My hearing is my most trusted tool, more reliable than any compass or GPS. It has saved my life more than once. But what I heard last Tuesday, deep in a forgotten hollow, wasn't in any language I knew. It was something else entirely, something ancient and predatory, that used the familiar sounds of love and fear as its lure. The call had come in that morning. A hiker, Daniel Miller, was overdue. He'd signed the trail log at the Nicholson Hollow trailhead for a solo day hike, a challenging but popular route that follows the Hughes River. He was experienced, well equipped, and according to his wife, Amelia, meticulous in his planning. When he hadn't returned by nightfall, she'd waited, telling herself he'd just misjudged the time. When he wasn't back by sunrise, she'd called us, her voice tight with a fear she was desperately trying to control. I met her at the station. She was a small woman, clutching a worn photograph of her husband. He was smiling, standing on a sun-drenched peak, the endless blue ridges of the Appalachians rolling out behind him. "He loves it here," she'd said, her voice barely a whisper. "He calls it his cathedral." She gave me his details: 5 years old, 6 foot, 1 brown hair, wearing a blue rain jacket and carrying a gray Osprey backpack. Then she looked at me, her eyes pleading. "He knows what he's doing. He wouldn't take unnecessary risks." I gave her the standard assurances, the calm, professional spiel we use to keep families from shattering while we do our work. But every ranger knows the truth. The mountains don't care how experienced you are. They have their own rules. The search began like any other. We established a command post, divided the area into grids, and sent out teams. I took a section myself, a rugged piece of terrain that branched off the main trail and descended into a deep, stream-carved hollow. It was off the beaten path, the kind of place a photographer like Daniel might wander into, chasing the perfect light. The air grew cooler as I descended, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves becoming thick and heavy. The roar of the main river faded, replaced by the gentle, intricate music of a smaller creek, babbling over moss-covered stones. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. It was peaceful, the kind of profound quiet that usually settled my soul. That's when I first heard it. It was a whisper, nothing more, riding the edge of the creek's sound. I stopped, tilting my head. my ears straining to isolate the noise from the water's gurgle. It was gone. Auditory pareidolia, I told myself. The brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise. When you spend enough time alone in the woods, you learn that the wind can sound like a voice, and a falling branch can sound like a footstep. It's a trick of the mind, your subconscious trying to populate the silence. I dismissed it and pushed on, my boots crunching softly on the leafy ground. I walked for another 10 minutes, following the winding path of the creek deeper into the hollow. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was still faint, a thread of sound woven into the tapestry of the forest, but it had a cadence, a rhythm that was distinctly human. I froze, every sense on high alert. I scanned the dense woods around me, my hand resting on the radio clipped to my shoulder. Nothing. No movement. No flash of color that didn't belong. Just the trees, the rocks, and the endless, patient quiet. I told myself it was another search team. Maybe on the ridge above me, their voices carrying on the wind. But the sound was too close, too intimate. It felt like it was right there, just beyond my line of sight. I keyed my radio. Thorn to command. I'm in grid 7, proceeding southwest along the creek. Anyone else in this sector? The reply came back, crackling with static. Negative, Caleb. Team Bravo is on the upper ridge, at least a mile east of your position. You're solo down there? A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I was alone. I kept moving, slower now, my initial confidence eroding with every step. The whispers continued, intermittent and maddeningly vague. They were like snippets of a conversation through a thick wall, the words just out of reach. I tried to focus on the search, on looking for tracks, a dropped water bottle, a piece of torn fabric, anything to prove Daniel had been here. But the sound was a constant distraction, a persistent itch in my brain. Then it changed. The formless whispers coalesced into a single, recognizable word. Daniel. It was a woman's voice, soft and laced with concern. It was so clear, so perfectly articulated, that I spun around, expecting to see someone standing right behind me. There was no one. The forest was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a trick of the mind. That was a voice. Hello, I called out, my own voice sounding loud and intrusive in the stillness. "Is someone there?" "This is Park Ranger Thorne." Only the creek answered. The whispering had stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It felt watchful. I stood there for a long time, straining to hear anything, but the voice was gone. Had I imagined it? Was the stress of the search finally getting to me? I was a 20-year veteran. I didn't imagine things. I dealt with facts, with evidence. The fact was, I had heard a voice call the missing hiker's name. My duty was clear. A voice meant a person. And a person in this remote area could be in trouble. It could be another hiker who had seen Daniel. It could be Daniel's companion, someone his wife didn't know about. Regardless, I had to investigate. Against every primal instinct screaming at me to turn back, I followed the direction the sound had come from, pushing deeper into the hollow. The terrain grew more difficult. The faint trail I'd been following disappeared completely, forcing me to navigate through thickets of mountain laurel and scramble over slick, mossy boulders. The air was thick with humidity, and the silence pressed in, broken only by my own labored breathing and the relentless babble of the creek. And then the voice returned, closer now, and filled with a desperate, pleading urgency. "Daniel, where are you?" It was the same woman. The sound was so real, so full of genuine anguish, that my ranger training took over completely. Someone was in distress. I keyed my radio again. Command, this is Thorne. I have an unidentified female voice calling for the missing hiker. I'm attempting to make contact, moving deeper into the hollow. I didn't wait for a reply. I plunged ahead, calling out as I went. This is the Park Service! Can you tell me where you are? Please help. Me, the voice sobbed, seeming to come from just ahead, beyond a thick wall of rhododendron. I can't find him. I fought my way through the dense vegetation, the branches scratching at my face and arms. I burst through into a small, shaded clearing. It was empty. The voice was now coming from my left, further downstream. It was toying with me, leading me on. A cold, terrifying thought began to form in my mind. What if the voice didn't need help? What if it was the thing that had made Daniel need help? But I couldn't stop. I had to know. I followed the sound for what felt like an eternity. A half-mile trek that took me into the wild, untamed heart of the park. A place where the trails were nothing but a memory. The voice was my only guide, a phantom beacon of distress pulling me further and further into the shadows. It was a perfect performance of a woman lost and terrified, her calls for Daniel, growing weaker, more pathetic, as if her strength was failing. It was a trap. I knew it in my bones, with the same certainty that I knew the feel of the sun and the sound of the wind. It was a beautifully, flawlessly constructed trap, and I was walking right into it. The knowledge that you are walking into a trap does little to prepare you for the moment it springs. Every rational part of my mind, the part honed by 2 decades of search and rescue, of analyzing tracks and reading weather patterns, told me to stop. It told me that the voice was a lure, that its performance of a terrified, lost woman was too perfect, too theatrical. Animals use camouflage and mimicry to hunt, to blend in or to draw prey closer. What I was hearing was the auditory equivalent of a pitcher plant, a sweet, promising sound that led only to a place of consumption. But the other part of me, the human part, the part that has pulled injured people from ravines and comforted lost children, couldn't ignore the sound of suffering, even if I suspected it was a lie. My duty was to find Daniel Miller, and this voice, whatever it was the only lead I had. The hollow grew narrower, the slopes on either side becoming steeper, their faces a jumble of ancient, lichen-covered boulders and tangled roots. The creek, my only constant companion, cut a deeper and deeper channel into the earth. The voice led me onward, its calls for Daniel, becoming fainter, punctuated by realistic, sounding sobs and sharp intakes of breath. It was a masterful performance, designed to pull at the most basic strings of empathy. It never stayed in one place for long. Each time I thought I was closing in, the sound would shift, moving another 50 yards downstream, always just out of sight, drawing me further from the known world. The air grew still and heavy, and the normal sounds of the forest, the chatter of a squirrel, the buzz of insects, the call of a distant bird, had vanished. The only sounds left were my own ragged breathing, the gurgle of the creek, and the phantom voice. My radio felt like a useless brick on my shoulder. What could I even report? Command, I'm following a ghost that's crying in the woods. They'd pull me for a psych evaluation. I was on my own, and the weight of that isolation pressed down on me with a physical force. I paused, leaning against a massive tulip, poplar to catch my breath, and scanned the oppressive woods. There was still nothing to see. No tracks but my own. No broken branches. No sign that any living thing, human or otherwise, had passed this way. It was as if the voice was emanating from the air itself. That's when the strategy of my unseen stalker changed. The pathetic, weeping voice of the generic lost woman fell silent. For a full minute, the woods were utterly quiet again, a heavy, listening silence that was more unnerving than the crying had been. I held my breath, my ears straining, and then a new sound began. It wasn't a cry of distress. It was a voice filled with a desperate, hopeful urgency. It was a voice I recognized. "Caleb, is that you? Over here?" My blood ran cold. It was the voice of Amelia Miller, Daniel's wife. It wasn't just similar. It was her. The exact pitch, the same slight lilt I'd heard in her voice just that morning at the station. I could hear the faint, underlying tremor of anxiety, the specific way she formed her words. It was a perfect, studio, quality recording of Amelia Miller's voice, and it was coming from the woods in front of me. The shift was jarring and profoundly terrifying. The entity I was tracking had been listening. It had been with me at the station, or it had somehow plucked her voice from my own memory. The concept of auditory pareidolia was a distant, laughable memory. This was not my brain making patterns. This was an intelligent predator, and it had just demonstrated a capability that defied all logic. It had learned. "Amelia," I whispered, the name a dry rasp in my throat.
"Yes, it's me. Caleb, thank God."
"I thought I was alone," the voice called back, and the sound of my own name, spoken in that perfectly mimicked voice, was a violation. It was a key turning in a lock that should never have been opened. I got his text. He said he was hurt. I came looking for him myself.
"I think he's down here."
My training, my experience, my sanity, it all screamed at me that this was impossible. Amelia Miller was at the command post, miles away, surrounded by other rangers. I had spoken to her on the radio myself, not 2 hours ago. Yet the sound was flawless. It was a perfect replica, imbued with convincing emotion. The thing in the woods had changed its lure. The generic damsel in distress hadn't been specific enough, so it had tailored the bait just for me. It was using the wife of the man I was searching for, using my own name to draw me in. It knew I was a rescuer. It knew what buttons to push. The voice led me another 100 yards to the edge of a narrow, deep ravine. It was a scar in the earth, a dark fissure where the creek plunged into shadow. The walls were sheer, wet rock, dropping at least 40 feet to a churning, boulder-choked bottom. It was a natural death trap. One slip, one misstep, and recovery would be a body bag operation. The voice of Amelia called out one last time, and this time it came from directly below me, from the bottom of that dark, unforgiving chasm. The performance was heart-wrenching, a perfect imitation of a wife finding her fallen husband.
"Honey, I'm down here!"
"I fell." The words echoed up from the ravine, a chilling blend of pain, fear, and a desperate, urgent plea for help. It was the single most compelling lure I could imagine. It was aimed not at Daniel, but at me, the ranger. It was a scenario I had trained for my entire career. Hiker falls, companion goes for help, or in this case, falls as well. My job was to rappel down there, to render aid, to be the hero. I stood at the edge, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I looked down into the shadows, my logical mind at war with the evidence of my own ears. I knew his wife was back at the station. I knew it. But the voice was so real. The raw, unadulterated terror in that perfect imitation of Amelia Miller was a physical thing. A wave of sound that washed over me and demanded action. For a terrifying second, I almost believed it. I took a half step forward, my hand already reaching for the rope in my pack. What stopped me was a single, tiny flaw in the performance, a flicker of something unnatural in the sound. In between the words, "I'm down here," and "I fell," there was a faint, almost imperceptible click. It was the sound of a recording stopping and starting. It was the sound of something mechanical, something that was not born of vocal cords and lungs. It was the tell. It was the predator showing its hand. And in that moment of clarity, the illusion shattered. This wasn't Amelia. This wasn't a person. This was a thing that wore voices like a hunter wears a deer skin. It had lured Daniel here with a sound he would trust, and now it was trying to lure me with a sound I was programmed to help. I didn't run. Running is what prey does. I simply stopped. I took one slow, deliberate step backward, then another. I didn't take my eyes off the ravine, half expecting something to come scrambling up the slick rock walls. But nothing appeared. The voice fell silent. The trap had been laid, the bait presented, but the prey had refused. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer watchful. It was sullen, disappointed. I backed away for 100 feet before I turned my back on that place. I didn't stop walking until I was out of the hollow, back on the main trail, with the familiar roar of the Hughes River filling my ears and the blessed sun on my face. I keyed my radio, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to control it. Thorn to command. "Go ahead, Caleb." Any luck? I hesitated, looking back toward the dark cleft in the mountains where the hollow hid. Negative, command. No sign of the hiker. I took a deep breath. But I'm marking Grid 7, Sector 4, as geographically unstable and unsafe for foot patrols. Effective immediately. There was a pause on the other end. Unstable. What's the issue? Rockslide risk? I thought about the perfect voice. The impossible mimicry, the cold intelligence in the trap. Something like that, I said. Just mark it unsafe. We never found Daniel Miller. His blue rain jacket, his gray Osprey pack, none of it ever turned up. It's as if the forest simply swallowed him whole. His wife, the real Amelia, eventually stopped coming to the station. The search was scaled back, then officially called off. He became another statistic, another name on the long list of people who walk into these mountains and never walk out. But I know what happened. He heard a sound he trusted, a sound he loved, a sound that led him to the edge of a ravine, from which there was no return. I don't know what the thing in the hollow is. I don't know what it looks like. But I know what it sounds like. It sounds like everything you want to hear. You don't report a monster. There's no form for it, no protocol. In the world of law enforcement and park management, a world built on facts, evidence, and tangible reality, there is no category for a predator that hunts with sound. So I said nothing. My report on the search for Daniel Miller was a model of professional brevity. It detailed the grid patterns, the hours logged, the terrain covered. It ended with the recommendation that Sector 4 of Grid 7 be closed due to unstable geological formations and potential rockslide hazards. It was a lie. But it was a lie the system could understand. It was a lie that put a red line on a map, a line that, for me, separated the known world from a place of absolute horror. Life after that day was like listening to a familiar song played in a different, discordant key. The forest, which had been my sanctuary for 20 years, now felt like a hostile territory I had to patrol. The language I had spent a lifetime learning was now corrupted. Every sound was suspect. The scream of a fox was no longer just a fox. For a split second, my mind would race, trying to dissect the sound for any hint of mimicry, any trace of the cold, intelligent performance I had witnessed in the hollow. The whisper of wind through the pines would make the hair on my arms stand up, and I'd find myself freezing, listening, waiting for it to form a word, a name. My auditory pareidolia, the harmless trick of the mind I had once so easily dismissed, had become a chronic condition, a form of psychological tinnitus where the ringing in my ears was the ghost of a voice that wasn't there. I became jumpy, irritable. My colleagues noticed the change. "Caleb, you need a vacation," my supervisor, Mark, told me one afternoon, after I'd nearly jumped out of my skin when a tourist dropped a metal water bottle on the visitor center floor. The sharp clang had, for a terrifying instant, sounded like the metallic click I'd heard in the ravine. I just nodded, unable to explain that a vacation wouldn't help. You can't take a vacation from your own mind. The hollow had planted a seed of doubt in me, and it was growing, its roots twisting around my certainty, my confidence, my sanity. Sleep offered little escape. I dreamt of the ravine. I dreamt of voices calling my name from the darkness. The voice of my deceased father. The voice of a childhood friend. All of them perfect replicas. All of them begging me to come closer, to step over the edge. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sounds still echoing in the silence of my bedroom, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the stillness of the night. I avoided Grid 7 like it was radioactive, which in a way it was. Whenever a new ranger was assigned a patrol near its border, I'd find a reason to divert them. Weather's turning nasty up there. I'd lie, or got a report of a territorial bear in that area. They looked at me strangely, but they were young, and I was the veteran. They trusted my judgment, never knowing I was protecting them from something my own report didn't dare to name. I was the keeper of a terrible secret, a lonely sentinel guarding a border on a map that only I knew was the frontier of a nightmare. For 6 months, life settled into this new, uneasy rhythm. Daniel Miller became a cold case, a cautionary tale for hikers. The red line on the map held. And then, in late April, when the dogwoods were blooming and the mountains were bursting with new life, a young woman went missing. Her name was Sarah. She was a college student, a biology major doing a solo field study on native ferns. Her car was found at the same trailhead Dale Miller had used Nicholson Hollow. When Mark gave me the news, a cold dread washed over me, so intense it was nauseating. Her research permit was for the area around the river, he said, pointing to a map on the wall. His finger was less than a mile from my forbidden zone. She's been gone for 2 days. Her parents are on their way. The old machinery of the search and rescue operation clanked into motion once again. The command post, the grid assignments, the interviews with frantic family members. It was all a horrifying echo of the Miller search. I was assigned a team, but I knew I couldn't lead them. I had to go alone. I couldn't risk anyone else hearing what I might hear. I couldn't be responsible for leading others into that trap. I took the same path I had taken 6 months before, down into the hollow, along the babbling creek. This time, however, the forest was not quiet. This time, the predator was not subtle. It was as if it knew I was coming back. It was as if it was waiting for me. The whispers started almost immediately, but they were different now. They were a chorus, a cacophony of voices all murmuring at once. I could pick out snippets, fragments of old radio broadcasts, lines from songs, the crying of a baby, a man laughing. It was a college of stolen sounds, a chaotic tapestry of human life being plagued that by something that was not human at all. It was testing its range, showing off its collection. Then, through the noise, a single voice cut through, clear and terrified.
Somebody, help me, please.
It was a young woman's voice. Sarah's voice. I had listened to her voicemail greeting on her phone back at the station. It was a perfect match. But I was not the same man who had walked here 6 months ago. The empathy, the instinct to rescue, was still there, but it was now shielded by a thick layer of cold, hard terror. I didn't call out. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, my hand resting on the handle of the large knife I now carried on my belt. A useless comfort against a foe I couldn't see.
He's here!
The voice of Sarah screamed, closer now.
The ranger! He's here to help us!
Us! Then a second voice joined the first. A man's voice. Thank God you're here, it said, the tone full of wary relief. We're down here. She's hurt badly. It was the voice of Daniel Miller. The sound hit me like a physical blow. It was him. The cheerful, confident voice from the photograph his wife had shown me, now strained with pain and fear. The thing in the woods had kept his voice. It had saved it. And now it was using them both in a twisted, two-part harmony of death. It was a puppet master, and it was making the dead sing. I finally reached the ravine. It was just as I remembered it, a dark, jagged wound in the earth. I stood at the edge, looking down into the shadows, my knuckles white on the grip of my knife. The voices rose up from the darkness below, a desperate duet. Sarah's pleas were interwoven with Daniel's reassurances that help had arrived. It was a trap, more elaborate, more cruel than the last. I didn't back away this time. I stood my ground. I couldn't save them. They were already gone. Their voices nothing more than ammunition for an unseen hunter. But I could refuse to be its next victim. I could bear witness. I unclipped my radio. I held it up, thumbing the transmit button. I didn't speak. I just let the open channel broadcast, the impossible sounds rising from the ravine. I let the cacophony of the damned, the stolen voices of Sarah and Daniel, begging for a help I could not give, pour into the ears of my colleagues miles away. I let it transmit for a full 30 seconds, a broadcast of raw, unexplainable horror. Then I switched it off, turned my back on the ravine, and walked away. I don't know what they made of it back at command. I never asked, and they never brought it up. My career as a ranger ended that day. I took an early retirement, citing stress. The official report lists Sarah, like Daniel, as missing, presumed deceased. The red line on the map of Shenandoah is still there. I know what it means. It's a tombstone. I live in a small town now, far from the mountains, but there is no place far enough. I still hear them sometimes, in the static between radio stations, in the murmur of a crowd. The voices. The collection is growing, I'm sure of it. And I know that the thing in the hollow is still there, listening, waiting. It is patient. And it is always hungry for a new voice to add to its song. My name is Maya Chen. It's a name that, until recently, was associated with academic journals, university grants, and the quiet, methodical world of botany. I am, or perhaps was, a graduate student at Virginia Tech, specializing in phytoremediation, the study of how plants can absorb and break down contaminants in soil and groundwater. It's a field of hope, a science dedicated to nature's incredible power to heal the scars left by humanity. My thesis was ambitious: to document the unassisted ecological recovery within one of the most notoriously toxic sites in the Appalachians, the West Virginia Ordnance Works, known locally and ominously as the TNT area. For a botanist, the TNT area is a paradox, a grimly fascinating natural laboratory. Spanning nearly 9,000 acres in Mason County, it was a major munitions manufacturing hub during World War II. For years, it churned out tons of trinitrotoluene, contaminating the land and water with a toxic legacy that has lingered for decades. After the war, it was abandoned. The government sealed the bunkers, erected fences, and essentially left the land to its fate. Nature, in its relentless way, began to reclaim it. Forests swallowed concrete roads, vines choked the life out of chain-link fences, and a strange, resilient ecosystem began to emerge from the poisoned earth. This was the focus of my research, to see what survives, what adapts, and what new life can rise from industrial death. I received the access permits after months of paperwork. The Park Service was hesitant, citing safety concerns that went beyond the chemical hazards. The area is a maze of decaying infrastructure. The most prominent features are the hundreds of concrete munitions bunkers, half buried in the earth like a procession of giant, grass-covered tombs. They call them hugloos, a deceptively quaint name for structures built to withstand catastrophic explosions. Setting up my base camp felt like establishing a colony on a hostile planet. I chose a small clearing, one of the few areas deemed relatively safe by the EPA's ancient survey maps. It was a lonely existence. My small, high-performance tent, my sampling equipment, and a satellite phone for emergencies were my only connections to the outside world. Cell service was a fantasy. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive down a crumbling access road. For the first 2 days, I fell into a rhythm. I'd wake with the sun, brew coffee on my portable stove, and spend the day hiking through the dense, unnervingly quiet woods. I'd navigate by GPS and a tattered map, moving from one bunker to the next, taking soil and plant samples, carefully labeling each one, my mind absorbed by the science. The place had an undeniable aura of dread. It wasn't just the isolation or the knowledge of the toxins seeping through the ground beneath my feet. It was the silence. In a normal forest, there is a constant hum of live birds, insects, the rustle of small animals. Here, the silence was sepulchral. It pressed in on you, heavy and watchful. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the skeletal trees that grew in strange, twisted shapes, and the crunch of my own boots on the gravelly soil. It was on the afternoon of the second day that I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a strange note on the breeze that cut through the usual scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was acrid and unpleasant, vaguely sulfuric. I dismissed it. The area was a chemical graveyard. Strange smells were to be expected. I imagined a pocket of old contaminants finally leaching to the surface after a heavy rain. I made a note in my logbook. Anomalous sulfur, like odor detected, grid 7B, possible chemical seepage, and thought nothing more of it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The silence outside my tent felt different, charged. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounded unnaturally loud. I kept imagining the silhouette of a person standing just beyond the reach of my headlamp, a trick of the shadows and an overactive imagination. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had planned to be out here for 2 weeks, and I couldn't let myself get spooked so early. The third day began like the others, but the feeling of being watched intensified. As I worked, I'd catch flickers of movement at the edge of my vision. When I'd turn, there was nothing but the dense tangle of undergrowth. And then there was the smell. It was stronger now, and it had changed. The sulfuric note was still there, but it was now mingled with something else, something deeply biological and foul. It was the smell of rot, but not plant rot. It was a greasy, heavy stench, like rancid meat left in the sun, combined with the sharp, sickening smell of burning hair. I stopped collecting my sample, my hand hovering over a patch of mutated ferns. The smell was coming from the north, deeper into a section of the park marked on my map as particularly dense with bunkers. My scientific training kicked in, overriding my primal urge to pack up and leave. A new chemical signature, a previously undocumented biohazard. My thesis was about recovery, but documenting ongoing threats was just as important. I reported it on the sat phone, my voice sounding small and thin. The ranger on the other end, a man named Henderson, sounded wary. A smell. Yeah, we get reports sometimes. Probably a decomposing bear or a deer that got stuck somewhere. Try to stay upwind, Miss Chen. But this wasn't a dead deer. I've smelled animal decay before. This was different. It was more complex, more industrial. The combination of sulfur and scorch protein was profoundly unnatural. Against my better judgment, I decided to locate the source. My curiosity, the driving force of any scientist, had become a dangerous liability. I followed the smell for nearly an hour, pushing through thickets of thornies that tore at my clothes. The air grew heavier, the stench so thick it was almost a taste at the back of my throat. It led me to a part of the ordnance work I hadn't explored yet, a cluster of larger, more fortified-looking bunkers. They were set further apart, half swallowed by the encroaching hillsides, and one of them was different from the rest. Most of the bunker doors I had seen were massive slabs of steel, rusted shut and sealed with thick welds. They were meant to stay closed forever. But this one was different. It was a colossal steel door, at least 10 feet high, set into a concrete headwall, and it was slightly ajar. A dark vertical slit, no more than a foot wide, broke the rusted seal. A dark, viscous liquid, like old oil, stained the concrete below the gap. And from this opening, the horrific smell billowed out in waves, a physical presence that made my eyes water and my stomach churn. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. Every instinct screamed at me to run. Henderson's advice about a dead bear seemed like a child's fairy tale in the face of this. No animal I knew of could produce a smell this vile, this complex, and no animal could have pried open a door forged to contain the apocalypse. Yet, the scientist in me, the foolish, stubborn academic, had to know. I had to see what was inside. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I crept toward the dark gap in the steel, my boots making no sound on the soft, damp earth. I reached the cold, rusted metal, peered into the suffocating darkness, and my world of logic and reason came to an end. The darkness inside the bunker was not absolute. A faint, sickly green light filtered down, from ventilation shafts high above, illuminating a scene straight from a charnel house nightmare. The floor was a carpet of bones. Not just deer or bear, but a horrifying mosaic of animal remains, many of which I couldn't immediately identify. They were splintered and gnawed, piled in drifts against the curved concrete walls. The source of the stench was here, a physical force that coated my tongue and burned my sinuses. But it wasn't the bones that made my blood run cold. It was what lay upon them. In the center of the vast, cavernous space, curled into a semblance of sleep, was a creature of impossible biology. It was immense, easily the size of a grizzly bear, but its form was grotesquely wrong. Its body was covered in a thick, filthy fleece of what looked like white wool, matted with grime, dried blood, and some kind of dark, oily secretion. Two great, curving horns, like those of a ram but thicker and wickedly sharp, jutted from its skull. Its head was long and vaguely canine, with a powerful jaw that hung slightly slack in slumber, revealing yellowed, tusk-like teeth. Its limbs were long and powerfully muscled, ending not in paws, but in something more like cleven hooves, dark and cracked. It was a monstrous hybrid, a blasphemous fusion of predator and prey. This was the source of the chemical smell. As I watched, paralyzed with a terror that went beyond reason, its massive chest rose and fell with a slow, deep rhythm. With each exhalation, a faint, shimmering puff of yellow, green gas escaped its nostrils, dissipating into the foul air. It was breathing sulfur. The legends I'd dismissed as local folklore, the campfire stories meant to scare tourists, flooded my mind. The sheepsquatch, a creature of Appalachian myth, described as a white, woolly beast with horns and a foul temper. I had laughed at the stories. Now, the impossible reality was sleeping on a bed of its victims not 20 feet away from me. My scientific mind, the one that had driven me here, shattered. There was no analysis, no hypothesis, only a single, primal command screaming through my consciousness. Survive. I began to back away, my movements agonizingly slow. I didn't dare take my eyes off the sleeping horror. Every fiber of my being was focused on not making a sound. My foot, clad in a sturdy hiking boot, came down on a loose piece of gravel. The crunch was deafening in the tomb-like silence. The creature's head twitched. A low growl, like the grinding of rocks, rumbled in its chest. One of its eyes, a slit of malevolent, goat-like yellow, opened and fixed on the gap in the door. It fixed on me. I didn't wait for the other eye to open. I didn't wait to see it rise. I turned and ran. Panic is a poor navigator. I fled without thought, without direction, crashing through the undergrowth, the thorny vines tearing at my skin and clothes like desperate hands. Branches whipped my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. The only thought was to put distance between myself and that thing. Behind me, I heard a sound that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. A deafening roar of fury, followed by the screech of metal as the massive steel door was forced open further. Then, the sound of heavy, thudding footsteps, impossibly fast, began to crash through the forest behind me. I have no idea how long I ran. Time dissolved into a blur of green foliage, brown earth, and gray sky. I stumbled, fell, and scrambled back to my feet, driven by pure adrenaline. I crossed streams, scrambled up ravines, and pushed through thickets so dense I had to turn sideways. The sounds of pursuit eventually faded, or perhaps I just outran my own hearing. Finally, my body gave out. I collapsed at a massive oak tree, my chest heaving, my body shaking uncontrollably. As the adrenaline subsided, pain made itself known. My arms and face were crisscrossed with bleeding scratches, my ankle throbbed, and every muscle screamed in protest. It was only then, as I looked around at the unfamiliar woods, that a new kind of fear set in. I was lost. My GPS, my map, my carefully planned route, all were forgotten in the blind flight. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, menacing shadows through the trees. I spent the next hour in a state of near catatonia before some semblance of rational thought returned. I had to get back to my camp. It was my only hope. I checked my watch. The compass function still worked. My camp was roughly to the southeast. Clinging to that single piece of data, I began to walk, limping heavily on my injured ankle. Every shadow seemed to hold the creature's form. Every gust of wind sounded like its sulfuric breath. The forest was no longer a place of scientific wonder. It was a hunting ground, and I was the prey. It was almost completely dark when I finally stumbled into the clearing. The sight of my small, lonely tent was both a relief and a source of profound dread. It was a flimsy nylon shell, a pathetic defense against the monster that now patrolled these woods. I scrambled inside, zipping it shut, as if that could offer any real protection. My hands shook so violently, I could barely operate my satellite phone. I had to call Henderson. I had to call for help. I dialed the number, my heart pounding with each electronic beep. It rang once, twice, then a click. Henderson. His voice was tired, bored. "It's Maya Chen," I gasped, my voice a ragged whisper. "You have to get me out of here. Now." I saw it. Whoa, slow down, Miss Chen.
What did you see? That bear! No, not a bear!
I can't explain it. It's big, white, with horns. It was in one of the bunkers.
It woke up, it chased me.
I knew how I sounded. Hysterical, insane. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear him sigh. "Listen, son. The TNT area plays tricks on your mind. It's the isolation, maybe some of the chemicals in the soil. You're overtired. Just try to get some sleep. I'll check on you in the morning."
No, you don't understand. It's real.
The smell, the sulfur smell. It's from the creature. A sulfur smell. For the first time, there was a different note in his voice. Not belief, but something else. Caution. "Where is your campsite, Miss Chen?" I rattled off my coordinates, my voice trembling. "All right," he said, his tone now clipped and professional. "Stay in your tent. Don't make any noise. Don't use any lights. I'll see what I can do. Don't call this number again." The line went dead. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the pursuit. He didn't believe me. Not really. But the mention of the sulfur smell had triggered something. What did he know? As I sat there in the suffocating darkness of my tent, a new horror dawned on me. The smell, the foul, unmistakable stench of burnt hair and rotten eggs, it was back. Faint, distant, but carried on the night air, slowly drifting towards my camp. It was hunting me, and it knew where I was. Time ceases to be a measurable quantity when you are waiting to be eaten. It stretches and compresses, each second an eternity, each minute a fleeting moment of terror. I sat frozen in my tent, a flimsy nylon tomb, with the zipper pulled up to my chin. My breath hitched in my throat, held captive by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight on my chest. The only light was the dim glow of my watch face, a silent testament to a world of order and reason that no longer existed. Outside, the night was alive with menace. The smell was the harbinger. It grew stronger, No longer a faint note on the wind, but a thick, suffocating blanket that seeped through the tent's fabric. It was the smell of the bunker, the smell of the beast. A nauseating perfume of sulfur, decay, and scorched wool. Then came the sounds. A heavy, rhythmic thud scrape, the sound of cloven hooves on the rocky soil, punctuated by a wet, guttural breathing that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It was circling my camp, slowly, methodically, a predator assessing its trapped prey. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. Don't let it see me. Don't let it smell me. But it already had. Henderson's words echoed in my mind. Stay in your tent. Don't make any noise. Don't use any lights. It wasn't advice, it was a protocol. A procedure for dealing with this. What did he know? Why did the mention of sulfur flip a switch in his brain from boredom to alarm? A low growl, deeper and more resonant than the one I'd heard in the bunker, rumbled through the clearing. It was close. So close I could almost feel the vibration against the tent wall. I imagined its goat, like yellow eye peering through the darkness, fixing on the fragile structure that was my only shelter. My scientific career, my thesis, my life before this moment. It all felt like a dream belonging to someone else. The only reality was the monster outside my tent. Then, a new sound cut through the night, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It was a mechanical rumble, the sound of an engine. Headlights sliced through the distant trees, bouncing and weaving as a vehicle navigated the treacherous access road. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through me. It was Henderson. He was coming to rescue me. He had believed me after all. The creature heard it too. The circling stopped. The guttural breathing paused. A new sound replaced it. A high, pitched, chittering noise, like the agitated clicking of 1,000 giant insects. It was a sound of irritation, of a hunt being interrupted. The heavy footsteps retreated, melting back into the darkness of the woods as the truck drew nearer. The vehicle, an old, beaten-up Ford pickup truck, painted with the emblem of the National Park Service, pulled into the edge of the clearing. It killed its engine but left the headlights on, bathing my small tent in a stark, artificial glare. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. It was Henderson. He was a silhouette against the bright lights, but I could see he was holding a high, powered rifle, not the standard issue for a park ranger. "S. Chen," he called out, his voice tight and strained. "Are you all right in there?" Relief washed over me so intensely it made me dizzy. I fumbled with the zipper, my numb fingers struggling to get a grip.
Yes, I'm here. It was just here.
"It ran off when you drove up. Stay where you are," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't move towards me. Instead, he scanned the tree line, the rifle held at the ready. The passenger door opened, and another man got out. He was younger, dressed in similar gear, and held a tranquilizer rifle, the kind used for relocating large game like bears or moose. This wasn't a rescue. This was a containment team. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't here to save me. They were here because of me. I was the problem. I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my hand frozen on the zipper. Henderson finally turned his attention from the woods to me. His face was grim, etched with a wariness that went bone deep. "You should have stayed away from the bunkers, Miss Chen. We have them marked off for a reason." "What is that thing?" I demanded, A new kind of fear replacing the primal terror. You know what it is? He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of resignation. We'll call it the shepherd. Been here for decades. A long time before me. It's a product of this place. The chemicals, the radiation, the isolation, they cooked up something new. It mostly keeps to itself, stays in its den. But sometimes it gets disturbed. People go missing in these woods. Hikers who wander off the trail. We put up signs, we give warnings, but people are curious. My blood ran cold. The missing person reports. They weren't just accidents. They were meals. And Henderson and his team, they were the groundskeepers of this toxic, monstrous garden. Their job wasn't to protect the public from the creature, but to protect the creature's secret from the public. What are you going to do? I asked, my voice trembling. Henderson's eyes were filled with a strange, hollow pity. You can't leave, Miss Chen. You can't tell anyone what you saw. You understand that, don't you? The panic, the media, the military descending on this place. We can't have that. We manage it. Quietly. He was going to make me another missing person statistic. Before I could scream, before I could run, the forest exploded. With a roar of pure, unadulterated rage. The sheep squatch burst from the tree line and charged into the clearing. It was a vision of hell. In the full glare of the headlights, I could see it clearly. The matted, blood-stained wool, the wickedly curved horns, the sulfurous steam pouring from its nostrils. It moved with a terrifying speed, its hooves tearing up the earth as it galloped towards the truck. Its yellow eyes blazing with hatred for the light and the noise. The younger ranger yelled and raised his tranquilizer rifle, but he was too slow. The shepherd slammed into the side of the pickup with the force of a freight train, caving in the door and sending the man flying. Henderson opened fire with his rifle, the shots echoing like thunder in the small clearing. The bullets struck the creature's thick hide, but they seemed to have little effect, only enraging it further. This was my chance. While the monster and the men were locked in their desperate battle, I ripped the tent zipper open and scrambled out the back. I didn't run towards the road. I ran back into the woods, into the suffocating darkness that had terrified me moments before. It was my only ally now. Behind me I heard the shriek of twisting metal, a man's scream cut short, and the triumphant, blood-curdling roar of the beast. I didn't look back. I just ran, fueled by a new, more complex terror. I was no longer just fleeing a monster. I was fleeing the men who had become monsters, themselves in their efforts to conceal it. I don't know how I made it out. I ran and walked all night, guided only by instinct and a desperate will to live. At dawn, I stumbled upon a logging road, and hours later, a trucker found me, a wild-eyed, mud-caked woman babbling about monsters and rangers. He thought I was on drugs, but he gave me a ride to the next town. I never went back for my equipment. I never finished my thesis. I reported my car stolen and disappeared. Maya Chen, the promising botany student, became another statistic, another person who went into the TNT area and never came out. I live a different life now, under a different name. I move from town to town, always looking over my shoulder, always sleeping with one eye open. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up smelling sulfur and burning hair, and I know that I will never truly be safe. The world has monsters, but the most dangerous ones are often those who wear a human face, the ones who guard the darkness and bury the truth, one missing person at a time. My name is Frank Miller. For 27 years, I've been a bridge inspector. It's not a glamorous job. Not the kind of thing you brag about at parties, but it's an honest one. It's a job of details, of understanding the language of steel and concrete, of listening for the whispers of stress and the groans of fatigue that the average person driving 60 miles an hour over a gorge never hears. I find problems before they become tragedies. I'm a professional, a pragmatist. I believe in physics, in material science, and in the measurable, predictable world. Or at least, I used to. The New River Gorge Bridge isn't just another structure. It's a monument, a steel arch that leaps nearly 900 feet over the river. A defiant slash of human engineering against a backdrop of ancient Appalachian wilderness. When you're on it, you feel the sheer scale of the thing. The wind has a different voice up there, a high, lonely cry that seems to carry stories from the forested hills. When you're under it, suspended on the catwalk that runs its entire length like a metal spine, the world changes. The roar of traffic above becomes a rhythmic, muffled thunder. The gorge below is a dizzying green and brown abyss. You're in a place that feels both man-made and profoundly alien. A cathedral of rust and rivets hanging in the sky. I've walked that catwalk 1,000 times. I know every bolt, every weld, every stain of rust like the lines on my own hand. It's a dangerous place, but it's a familiar one. Last month, we were scheduled for a routine biennial inspection. It's a top-to-bottom affair, a deep dive into the bridge's very bones. My partner for this job was Dave, a good kid, barely 30. Sharp and eager, but still carrying that city, bred nervousness about heights and darkness. We often worked at night. It was easier without the constant vibration of daytime traffic, and the focused beams of our headlamps could catch the glint of a hairline fracture better than the diffuse light of day. The night in question was a typical West Virginia summer night. Heavy, humid, and so dark it felt like you could scoop it up in your hands. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets from the woods far below, the distant rumble of a freight train following the river, and the metallic clank of our boots on the grated steel of the catwalk. We were about a third of the way across, inspecting the massive vertical supports that connected the roadway to the arch. It was slow, meticulous work. Tap, listen, look. Run the ultrasound scanner over a critical joint. Watch the readings. Make a note. The world shrank to the circle of light from our headlamps. Everything outside that bubble was just a vast, black emptiness. Getting some weird feedback on this transducer, Frank, Dave said, his voice tinny over the radio. I clanked my way over to him. Let me see. I took the scanner from his hand. The readings were fluctuating, jumping erratically. Probably just interference. Battery getting low. Should be fine. Put a fresh one in before we started. I tapped the device against my palm. The numbers settled. There, gremlins. Let's keep moving. But a seed of unease had been planted. The bridge had its own sounds, its own rhythm, but tonight felt different. The wind seemed to be whispering, just at the edge of hearing. A couple of times, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of shadow in the complex latticework of steel above us. But when I snapped my head up, there was nothing but the unmoving beams. We reached the central support, directly over the deepest part of the gorge. This was our final checkpoint for the night. I was running my hand over a primary stress joint, feeling for any vibration or unevenness, when Dave suddenly froze. "Frank," he whispered, his voice tight. "Don't move." I stopped, every muscle tensing. In this job, a warning like that could mean a dropped tool from above, a slipped safety line, 100 different things that could kill you. "What is it, Dave? What do you see?" "Up there," he breathed, his headlamp beam pointing straight up, quivering slightly. "On the upper beam. Look." I followed his light, and I saw it. It was perched on one of the upper support beams, about 50 feet above us. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it, to categorize it. A large bird, an owl, but it was too big and the shape was all wrong. It was tall and vaguely man-like, but gaunt, its limbs too long and thin. And folded behind it were what looked for all the world like wings. Not feathered wings, but something more leathery, like a bat's, shrouded in the deep shadows. We couldn't see a face, no discernible features at all. There was just a head-shaped darkness. And in the center of it, 2 large red circles. They didn't glow on their own. They caught the light from our headlamps and reflected it back. A deep ruby red, like bicycle reflectors. It didn't move. It just sat there, a silent, impossible silhouette against the faint starlight, watching us. The crickets seemed to have gone silent. The wind died down. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart. "What in God's name is that?" Dave stammered, taking a half-step back. I couldn't answer. My mind, the pragmatic, scientific mind of Frank Miller, was scrambling, trying to find a logical explanation. A shadow, a trick of the light, some kind of weird kite or drone caught in the beams. But none of it fit. The sheer presence of thing was overwhelming. It felt ancient, and it felt intelligent. The way it watched us wasn't the vacant stare of an animal. It was an appraisal. We stood there for what felt like an eternity. 2 men frozen on a steel grate, 900 feet in the air, stared down by something that shouldn't exist. My hand was still resting on the stress joint, and I could feel a faint, almost imperceptible tremor through the steel, a vibration that had nothing to do with traffic or wind. Finally, I found my voice. "Let's pack it up," I said, my voice a low croak I barely recognized. "We're done for the night." "Done? Frank, we have to report this?" "We have to." "Report what?" "Dave?" I cut him off, grabbing his arm. "That we saw a giant bug, men sitting on the bridge. They'll have us in for psych evaluations before sunrise. We saw a shadow. That's it. Now let's go." I didn't believe my own words, but the fear of ridicule was, for a moment, stronger than the fear of the unknown. We gathered our equipment with fumbling, clumsy hands, never taking our eyes off the shape above. It never moved. It just watched us go. Its red eyes the last thing we saw as we retreated back down the catwalk toward the solid ground of the abutment. The next morning, the world felt normal again. The sun was out, the sky was blue, and the memory of the night felt like a dream. A hallucination brought on by fatigue and darkness. Dave was quiet, pale. We didn't talk about it. We just got our gear and went back to work. A silent agreement hanging between us to pretend it never happened. We went right back to the central support where we had stopped. I tried to focus, to put the image of red eyes out of my mind. I knelt by the same primary stress joint I had been touching when we saw it. In the clear light of day, I ran the scanner over it again. The readings were stable, well within tolerance. I was about to move on, to dismiss the whole thing, when something caught my eye. A tiny, faint line, no thicker than a human hair, near the base of the well. I pulled out my magnifying glass. My blood ran cold. It was a hairline fracture. a clean, sharp crack in a primary stress joint. It was the kind of structural failure that shouldn't have been possible, not on a bridge this meticulously maintained. It was small, but it was in a place where even a small failure could, under the right load and the right temperature, cascade into a catastrophic disaster. We shut the bridge down immediately for emergency repairs. My boss, a suit from Charleston, clapped me on the back and called it a lucky catch, a testament to my sharp eyes. He said I'd probably saved hundreds of lives, but I knew it wasn't luck. Standing there in the bright sunshine, I could still feel the chill of the night before. I could still see those two red eyes watching me from the darkness. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a threat. I think we were warned. And the most terrifying part, the thought that keeps me awake at night, is wondering what it was warning us about. The crack in the steel was just the beginning. The 2 weeks that followed the discovery of the fracture were a blur of controlled chaos. The bridge, our silent giant, was wounded, and the full weight of the state's engineering corps descended upon it. They brought in metallurgists, structural analysts, and teams of welders who swarmed the underbelly of the arch like wasps on a nest. The official story was that it was a premature stress corrosion crack, a 1 in a million fluke, a narrative of random chance, of material imperfection. It was a clean, tidy explanation that fit neatly into reports and satisfied the bureaucrats in Charleston. It was also a lie. I knew it was a lie, and so did Dave. But we were trapped in our silence. How do you inject a giant, winged cryptid with reflective red eyes into a discussion about tensile strength and metallurgical fatigue? We couldn't. So we played our parts. I was the hero, the sharp-eyed veteran who caught the fluke. I was interviewed by a local paper, my picture plastered next to a headline that read, "Bridge disaster averted by local inspector." They made me sound like a folk hero. It felt like swallowing ash. Dave didn't fare as well. The kid was haunted. The easy confidence he once had was gone, replaced by a skittish, nervous energy. He'd jump at the sound of a dropped wrench. I'd catch him staring up into the steel latticework during the day, his eyes searching the empty spaces where it had been. We'd work side by side for hours, the silence between us thick with the thing we refused to name. One afternoon, during a break, he finally cracked. "You don't really think that was just a lucky catch, do you, Frank?" he asked, his voice low, his hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette. I looked away across the gorge. The hills were a deep, hazy green. "We did our job, Dave. We found a weak point. That's all that matters." "No," he shook his head, the unlit cigarette bobbing between his lips. "That thing, it was looking right at us. Right at that spot. You were touching it, Frant. You felt it, didn't you?" The vibration. I didn't answer. Yes, I had felt it. A low, thrumming hum that seemed to resonate in my bones, a feeling that had nothing to do with the bridge itself. "I've been reading," Dave went on, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Local stuff, old newspapers online. This area, it has a history. Strange sightings, weird lights. They call it the Mothman." He said the name as if it were a curse. "They say it shows up before disasters. Point Pleasant, 1967. The Silver Bridge collapse. It was seen for months beforehand. Over 100 sightings. Then, tragedy. That's just folklore, kid," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. Grief and superstition. People trying to make sense of the senseless. We deal with facts, with physics, not ghost stories. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and frustration. The crack was a fact, Frank. And so was that thing. How can you separate them? He threw the unlit cigarette to the ground and walked away, leaving me alone with his question hanging in the humid air. The truth was, I couldn't separate them. His words had burrowed into my mind, planting a seed of dread that began to sprout in the dark corners of my thoughts. I started noticing things. Small things at first. My truck's radio would hiss with static whenever I drove over the bridge, clearing up the moment I was on the other side. The new state of the art sensors the engineering team had installed on the repaired joint would give off bizarre, phantom readings in the middle of the night. Readings that were always gone by morning, dismissed as telemetry glitches. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. It wasn't just on the bridge anymore. I'd be in my small house, miles from the gorge. I'd get the feeling. A prickling on the back of my neck, the distinct, unnerving sensation of eyes on me from the darkness outside my window. I'd pull the curtains, but I could still feel it. A silent, patient appraisal. Then came the phone calls. They started about a week after the repairs were completed. I'd pick up the phone, and there would be nothing but a strange electronic warbling. It sounded like a high frequency, shriek mixed with a sound like tearing metal, a sound that made the fillings in my teeth ache. I'd hang up, my heart hammering, only for the phone to ring again moments later with the same terrifying noise. I reported it to the phone company. They sent a technician out, a young man who checked the lines, found nothing wrong, and looked at me with pity, as if I were a lonely old man losing his mind. The breaking point came with Dave. He called me late one night, his voice frantic, barely coherent.
It's back, Frank. I saw it.
Outside my apartment.
The eyes. God, the red eyes.
Slow down, Dave.
Tell me what you saw. It was just there.
In the trees behind the parking lot. Watching me.
It knows, Frank.
It knows we saw it. It's not just the bridge anymore. It's following us, he was sobbing now. I can't do this, man. I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm not sleeping. I think I'm going crazy. I tried to calm him down, told him I'd be right over. But by the time I got to his apartment complex, his car was gone. He didn't show up for work the next day, or the day after. A week later, our boss called me into his office. Dave had officially resigned. He'd sent an email from a public library computer, 2 counties over. He said he was taking a long vacation, that the stress of the job had gotten to him. He was gone. A missing person who wasn't technically missing. He'd just vanished. I was alone with the secret. That night, driven by a desperation I didn't recognize in myself, I did what I'd scorned Dave for doing. I went to the town library and I started to read. I pulled up old microfilms, dusty county histories, and archived articles about the Silver Bridge. The parallels were horrifying. The reports from 1966 and 1967 in Point Pleasant described a tall, winged figure with glowing red eyes. They described electrical interference, malfunctioning phones and televisions, and that pervasive, creeping sense of being watched. It was all there, a blueprint for my own personal hell. The Silver Bridge had been an I-bar, chain suspension bridge, a design known for its lack of redundancy. A single, critical failure in one link of the chain could cause a total collapse. The official report blamed a small stress crack in a single I-bar, a flaw just 2.5 millimeters deep. A hairline fracture, the same as ours. I left the library feeling hollowed out, the pragmatist in me finally, irrevocably dead. The warning we received on the New River Gorge Bridge wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern, a prelude. Driving home, a storm broke. Rain lashed against my windshield, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, momentary flashes. As I turned onto my street, my headlights cut through the downpour and fell upon something standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a halt just feet away. It was him, the Mothman, taller than I remembered, its great, leathery wings partially unfurled, as if to shield itself from the rain. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was terrifyingly real. In the strobing flashes of lightning, I could see the texture of its skin, a mottled gray, brown like old stone. And the eyes. The two red circles burned through the rain, fixed directly on me. They weren't just reflectors anymore. They were glowing with their own internal, malevolent light. Then it unfolded its wings to their full, magnificent span, blocking the entire road. It let out a sound, the same high-pitched, electronic shriek from the phone calls, a sound that vibrated through the truck's chassis and into my very soul. It was a sound of pure, technological agony. As it shrieked, my truck died. The engine cut out, the headlights blinked off, and the radio let out one last squawk of static before falling silent. I was plunged into darkness, alone in a dead machine, with only the storm and the two burning red eyes of the thing that had come to warn us. And in that moment, I finally understood. The crack in the bridge wasn't the disaster. It was just the omen. The real disaster was still coming. The silence inside my truck was colder than the storm raging outside. The engine was dead, the headlights dark. I was submerged in blackness, punctuated only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated its form, standing sentinel on the road, and the two crimson orbs that burned in the void. I should have screamed. I should have tried the dead ignition or thrown open the door and run for the woods. But I was paralyzed, staring through the windshield in a state of pure, primal fear. It made no move to approach. It just stood there, its monstrous wings spread like a monument to nightmare. The shrieking, metallic wail had stopped, but I could still feel its echo in my skull, a vibration in my teeth, in my bones. It wasn't the sound of a threatening beast. It was the sound of agony, the agony of technology. Then, slowly, it folded its wings, turned its back to me, and stepped into the curtain of rain and darkness, disappearing. It left me alone with my dead truck and a terrifying truth just beginning to coalesce in my mind. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark. It could have been minutes or the better part of an hour. Eventually, instinct returned. I turned the key. Nothing. The dashboard was a black void. I tried the radio. Silence. My truck wasn't just broken, it was inert, as if its entire electrical soul had been ripped out at once. I got out, the cold rain shocking me back to some semblance of reality. I walked around the truck, shining the small flashlight on my keychain, which, miraculously, still worked on the engine. No visible damage, no smoke, no smell of burning. It was as if someone had simply flipped a switch. I walked the short distance to my house, soaked and chilled to the bone. The first thing I did was go to the landline. I picked up the receiver. No dial tone. I tried the television. A black screen. The lights in the house worked. But anything more complex than a simple incandescent bulb was now a useless piece of junk. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark of my living room, listening to the storm and trying to piece it all together. That scream, it was the same sound from the phone calls. My truck radio had hissed with static near the bridge. The new sensors had glitched. Dave said he saw it, that it was following us. No, it wasn't following us. It was following the technology. The folklore said Mothman appeared before a disaster. People assumed it was a harbinger of physical death and destruction, like the collapse of the Silver Bridge. But what if they were wrong? What if the disaster it warned of wasn't the failure of steel, but the collapse of something else entirely? The crack in the bridge wasn't the cause. It was a symptom. A physical side effect of something much larger, something unseen, something energetic. The New River Gorge Bridge is a massive steel structure, a gigantic tuning fork spanning a deep canyon. It could be doing something to the ambient electromagnetic field, something we don't understand, amplifying it, generating it, or perhaps attracting it. And that creature, Mothman, it might not be a messenger of doom. It might be a canary in a coal mine, a being uniquely sensitive to this kind of energy. It didn't come to warn us in a way we could understand. It was simply reacting to the energy building up. Its scream was the sound of its own torment from that energy, and the effect on my electronics was the fallout from its cry. As the first light of dawn filtered through the window, the full, horrifying realization hit me. The real disaster hadn't happened yet. The next day was Bridge Day, the annual festival where they close the bridge to traffic and allow hundreds of people to walk across it, to watch BS jumpers leap from its railings to the river below. A day when hundreds of people, with hundreds of cell phones, cameras, and countless other electronic devices, would be gathered on the massive steel structure that was about to become ground zero for a technological apocalypse. I had to do something. I called the sheriff's department from a neighbor's working phone, trying to explain the potential electromagnetic threat. I talked about the sensor anomalies, the power failures. I carefully avoided the word Mothman, but my voice was tight with panic. They listened politely and said they would look into it, which was code for, "Get lost, you crazy old man." I called the state engineer's office. I invoked my position as the inspector who found the crack. I begged them to cancel Bridge Day, to run a full electrical diagnostic. They told me I'd been working too hard, that I should take a vacation. Nobody believed me. I had become one of those people from Point Pleasant in 1967, trying to warn everyone about what they'd seen, only to be dismissed as a lunatic. I had one last, desperate option. The morning of Bridge Day was cruelly beautiful. The sun glinted off the steel arch. I drove a small rental car. My truck was still a paperweight to one end of the bridge. The crowds were already arriving. Laughing families, teenagers snapping selfies. The atmosphere was festive. To me, it felt like a funeral procession. I made a crude sign from a piece of cardboard at the back seat, scrawling on it with a thick, black marker.
Donjar!
Hey, G-E-L-E-N-A, feel
TROFALLEL-KIONS. I stood by the side of the road holding my sign. People streamed past me. Some gave me curious looks. Some laughed. A teenager pointed at me and said something to his friends. I heard the word, "Freak, please, listen to me." I shouted, my voice raw.
Something is wrong with this bridge. It's not safe. Turn off your phones.
2 police officers approached me. "All right, Pops, that's enough," the taller one said. "You're making a scene."
You don't understand.
I pleaded.
It's not the structure. It's the energy.
"It's going to. Go on home and get some rest, Mr. Miller," the other one said, his tone gentle but firm. "Don't make us take this any further." They escorted me back to my car and watched until I drove away. I was defeated. I drove to a scenic overlook on a hill with a clear view of the entire span. All I could do was watch. By noon, the bridge was teeming with people. Hundreds of tiny, moving dots. From a distance, it looked peaceful. And then I saw it. Mothman appeared as if from nowhere. Circling high above the center of the arch, a dark silhouette against the blue sky. No one on the bridge seemed to notice. They were all looking down at the jumpers at the view. And then it screamed. The sound was too far away for me to hear, but I saw its effect. A simultaneous flash of light erupted all across the bridge. Not one flash, but hundreds. Cell phones in people's hands, cameras around their necks, detonating like firecrackers. This was followed by louder bangs as car batteries in the nearby parking lots circuited and caught fire. Panic was instantaneous. People screamed, ran, trampled one another. Plumes of black smoke billowed up from the burning cars. It wasn't a structural collapse. It was worse. It was a technological massacre taking place nearly 900 feet above the ground. I watched in horror, tears streaming down my face. I had tried to warn them. Amid the smoke and chaos, I saw Mothman circle one. Last time before turning and flying back into the deep valleys and ancient forests of the Appalachian Mountains. Its work was done. The disaster had come to pass. I used to inspect bridges. Now I am a witness. The last survivor of a warning that went unheard. I don't know what that creature was, or where it came from. But I know one thing: it didn't come to predict the future. It came to warn us about the present, about the invisible dangers lurking in the world of steel and wire we have built for ourselves. And now, I am the only one left to remember its scream. My name is David Rourke, and for 27 years I've been a search and rescue officer in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I've seen the soul of these mountains, the breathtaking beauty and the unforgiving heart of them. I've pulled survivors from ravines and carried the unfortunate back to their grieving families. In this line of work, you collect ghosts. Not the spectral, chain-rattling kind, but the quiet, heavier kind. The faces you can't forget, the questions that never get an answer. They settle in your bones, a permanent chill that the warmest summer day can't quite thaw. Most cases, you close the book. You find them, one way or another. But one case remains open for me, a wound that never scarred over. The case that haunts me, the one that still wakes me in the dead of night, is the disappearance of 8-year-old Sarah Becker in the autumn of '98. It was October, the time of year the Park Service calls the leaf peeping season. The mountains had set themselves on fire, a riot of crimson, gold, and blazing orange under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. It was a perfect day for a hike, and the Becker family, down from Knoxville for the weekend, had chosen the Deep Creek Trail for its gentle grade and scenic waterfalls. They were a postcard family, 2 parents, a 12-year-old son, and little Sarah, a vibrant spark of a girl with bright, curious eyes and hair the color of corn silk, tied back in 2 bouncing pigtails. The call came in just as the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and pink. The voice on the other end was frantic, cracking with a panic I knew all too well. It was Mr. Becker. They had stopped for a water break near Indian Creek Falls. Sarah had been playing a game with another boy from a different hiking group. a little younger than her, maybe 7. The parents had looked away for no more than 5 minutes, talking to the other boy's family. When they turned back, the boy was there, but Sarah was gone. Standard procedure kicked in. We established a perimeter, got a description, and started the clock. In the wilderness, the first 24 hours are everything. We assembled a team at the trailhead, the mood grimly professional. I took the lead in interviewing the parents and, more importantly, the only witness, the little boy, Leo. He was a small, pale child, wrapped in an oversized emergency blanket, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Getting a coherent story from a terrified child is like trying to catch smoke in your hands. His parents hovered nearby, wringing their hands, which only made him more agitated. I knelt, keeping my voice low and calm, and asked him what happened to his new friend. She went with the lady, he whispered, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods beyond the parking lot. What lady, Leo? I asked, my pen poised over my notepad. Was she with another family? He shook his head. No, she was old. Like my grandma. This was a potential lead. An abduction. It shifted the entire dynamic of the search. What did she look like? Did she have white hair, like your grandma? Yes, he said, nodding. And a nice smile. She told Sarah she had candy at her house. The good kind. The ones in the crinkly wrappers. My blood ran a little colder. The classic, horrifyingly simple lure. Did you see where they went? Leo pointed a trembling finger toward the dense thicket of rhododendron that bordered the trail. In there. Sarah waved at me. She was happy. He paused, his small brow furrowed in thought. It was the detail he added next that snagged in my mind, a tiny, sharp burr that I couldn't shake loose. She was nice, he repeated, but she was funny. Funny how? Leo. She kept her hand in her pocket, he said, looking down at his own hands. Her right one. The whole time. She picked up a pretty rock with her other hand. To show Sarah, but she never, ever took her right hand out of her pocket. An old lady who looks like a grandmother, offering candy, who keeps one hand hidden. It was strange. It was specific. It was the first thread in a tapestry of wrongness that would come to define this case. As night fell, the forest transformed. The beautiful sun dappled woods became a labyrinth of monolithic trees and grasping shadows. The air grew teeth. Our headlamps cut cones of nervous light through the oppressive dark, and the calls of Sarah were swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. We searched through the night, a grid of weary bodies moving through the unforgiving terrain, fueled by coffee and a desperate, dwindling hope. It was just after dawn when one of the volunteers found it. About a mile off the Deep Creek Trail, down a steep embankment and across a shallow, rushing stream was Sarah's backpack. It was a small, bright pink thing, adorned with a cartoon cat. It was propped neatly against the massive tulip poplar, almost as if it had been placed there for us to find. It wasn't torn or muddy. Inside, we found her water bottle, still half full, a Ziploc bag with a half-eaten apple, and a child's drawing of her family, all holding hands under a smiling sun. There was no sign of a struggle. It was just there. The discovery of the backpack led us to the second anomaly. Not 50 yards from where it was found, nearly swallowed by the forest, was a faint, almost imperceptible trail. It wasn't a game trail, it was too deliberate. It led us up a small rise to a place that shouldn't have existed. It was a small, unmapped cabin. It wasn't on any of our Park Service maps, old or new. It was built of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a rusty tin roof and a single stone chimney. It was old, ancient even, but it wasn't a derelict ruin. It was intact. It looked maintained. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. This was it. This had to be the place the nice old lady was talking about. We approached with caution, our senses on high alert. The air around the cabin was still and heavy. No smoke came from the chimney. No light shone from the single, grimy window. My deputy, a young, capable man named Ben, moved to the front door while I scanned the perimeter. And that's when we saw the third thing. The thing that, to this day, I cannot explain. The door was made of thick, solid oak, weathered by 100 years of mountain storms. It was a fortress of a door, and punched directly through the center of it, at about chest height, was a hole. It wasn't a bullet hole. It was too wide and perfectly circular. It wasn't made by a drill. The edges were too smooth on the outside, but violently splintered inward on the cabin's interior. It was a single, deep, perfectly round hole, about an inch in diameter, as if someone had taken a superheated steel spike and driven it through 2 inches of solid oak with a single, impossible blow. We stood there for a long moment, staring at that unnatural aperture. The woods were silent around us. The birds had stopped singing. All the pieces were wrong. The grandmotherly woman with the hidden hand, the neatly placed backpack, and now this cabin, which didn't exist on any map with its impossible wound. Ben looked back at me, his eyes wide. I nodded, my hand resting on the grip of my sidearm. We had to go in. Whatever answers we were going to find, they were on the other side of that violated door. Ben looked at me, his wide eyes reflecting the silent forest behind us. A dozen questions swam in his gaze, but he didn't voice them. He didn't have to. I felt it too. The cold dread coiling in. My gut had nothing the crisp October morning. It was a primal wrongness. An alarm bell honned by years in these woods, screaming that something was fundamentally, terribly amiss. I gave Ben a short nod, a silent confirmation that we had to go in. I unsnapped the holster of my sidearm, but didn't draw it. The gesture was more of a psychological anchor than a practical preparation. The oak door had no knob or lock, just a simple wooden bar on the inside. Ben hit it with his shoulder once. A dull thud, but the door held. He hit it again, harder. And this time there was a splintering crack. With a third, final shove, the bar broke, and the door swung inward, revealing the dim interior. The air that spilled out wasn't the musty, dusty smell I expected from an abandoned place deep in the woods. It was clean, unsettlingly clean, almost sterile with a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat, like the ghost of old blood scrubbed away. We stepped cautiously over the threshold, the morning light spilling in behind us, illuminating a single, shockingly sparse room. There were no cobwebs, no thick layer of dust that should have blanketed a place like this. The plank floor was swept clean. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a gray wool blanket folded neatly at its foot. In the center of the room stood a small wooden table and a single chair. On the table, there was nothing at all, except for the one thing that made my heart seize in my chest. It was a single, brightly colored candy wrapper. The crinkly, glossy kind Leo had described. It lay there, stark and solitary, a silent, damning confirmation of the boy's story. A kind old lady with a sweet promise. The candy was gone. And so was Sarah Becker. My eyes swept the room. No clothes, no dishes, no personal effects to suggest who lived here. It felt more like a stage set than a home. In the corner, a stone fireplace was cold and swept clean of all ash. But it was the objects on the sill of the single, grimy window that drew my attention. It was a row of smooth, gray river stones. They were arranged in a neat line along the length of the sill, each one similar in size and shape, almost like a collection of pale, severed fingers. I walked over and picked one up. It was cool and heavier than it looked, its surface worn smooth, as if tumbled for a century in a rushing creek. I thought of what Leo had said, how the old woman had kept her right hand hidden, her pocket the entire time. A terrible, primitive thought began to form in my mind, so wild and irrational that I tried to shove it away. "Dave, look at this." Ben's voice came from the other side of the room. He was kneeling beside a small wooden chest tucked under the cot. It was an old, plain pine box with a rusted latch. Ben pried it open easily. The contents were not treasure or valuables, but something 100 times more horrifying. It was a collection of sad little trophies. Trophies from children. There was a worn, tattered teddy bear, one of its button eyes missing. A single child's sneaker, small and red, faded and stained with dirt. A faded hair ribbon, a few small, carved wooden toys. Each item on its own was an ordinary thing a child might carry in their pocket. But together, in this chest, in this cabin that shouldn't exist, they became a testament to a repeating tragedy. This wasn't the first time. This woman, or whatever it was, had done this before. That cold feeling washed over me again, this time with a new and terrible intensity. A deeply buried memory surfaced. A story my Cherokee grandmother used to tell me by the fire on windy nights. A story she used to scare me out of wandering into the woods alone. A story about an ancient, shifting witch who often took the form of a kindly, looking old woman to lure away disobedient children. A witch whose right forefinger was a sharpened, stony spear she used to pierce the livers of her victims. Atlanta. The spearfinger. I shook my head, trying to banish the ridiculous folklore. I was a law enforcement officer, not a storyteller. There was a rational explanation for all of this. There had to be. But then my eyes fell on the hole in the oak door. The perfectly round, smooth hole, as if pierced by a heated spike. A stone finger. I looked at the smooth stone in my hand, then at the chest of lost children's toys. The pieces were clicking together in a way that was both horrifying and impossible. We searched every inch of that cabin, but we found nothing else. No trace of Sarah. No forensic evidence that anyone actually lived there. No fingerprints, no hair. Nothing but the staged emptiness and the gruesome collection in the chest. The trail ended there, as if the old woman and Sarah had simply vanished into thin air. The weeks that followed blurred into a desperate, fruitless search. We combed a multi-mile radius around the cabin with hundreds of volunteers, canine units, and helicopters. We found nothing. No tracks. No scraps of clothing. No sign that Sarah Becker had ever been there. The forest had swallowed her whole. The Becker family stayed in town for a month, the hope on their faces slowly eroding, replaced by a hollow, resigned grief. They eventually returned to Knoxville, leaving behind only the missing person flyers, tacked to trees and notice boards, Sarah's smiling face slowly fading in the sun and rain. Officially, the case is still open, filed away as a non-family abduction. But for those of us who were at the cabin, who saw the hole in the door and felt the cold wrongness in the air, we knew it was something else. Over the years, I've heard the whispers from old timers and other park rangers. Stories of the old woman of the creek, and of children who go missing in these mountains every 20 or 30 years. Stories I once dismissed as campfire tales now echoed in my mind with a terrifying ring of truth. The Sarah Becker case left a scar on me. It changed the way I see these mountains. Now, when I walk a quiet trail, I'm not just looking for tracks or broken branches anymore. I'm listening for a soft whisper on the wind. And I'm watching for a lone old woman, always keeping one hand tucked deep inside her pocket. 25 years is a long time. It's long enough for a forest to reclaim a forgotten trail, for a wound to become a dull ache, and for a nightmare to curdle into a local legend. The story of Sarah Becker became one of those campfire tales, whispered to wide-eyed tourists. A cautionary fable about straying from the path. They get the details wrong, of course. They talk about a wild man or a bear, embellishing the parts that are easy to understand and omitting the parts that are not. They never talk about the impossible hole in the door or the unsettling cleanliness of the cabin, or the little boy who insisted the nice old lady never, ever took her right hand out of her pocket. Those details belong to me, to Ben, and to the silence of the mountain. Ben retired a decade ago, moving down to Florida to escape the mountain winters and, I suspect, the ghosts that linger in the autumn mist. We don't talk about the Becker case. We never have. Some things are too heavy to be lifted by words. But I stayed. These mountains are in my blood, and leaving would feel like a betrayal, not just to my post, but to her, to Sarah, her smiling, fading face on that flyer is burned into the back of my mind. She is the quiet passenger I will carry with me until my own last day. The case turned me into a different kind of officer. I became obsessed with history, with the deep, unwritten lore of these hills. I spent my off days in archives and talking to the oldest members of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Men and women with eyes that held the memory of generations. I'd bring them coffee and just listen. At first, they were hesitant to speak of the old fears. But when I described the cabin, the hidden hand, and the stone-like finger I imagined, their expressions would change. A veil of ancient dread would fall over their faces. They told me more about Atlanta. They said she was a creature of immense power and patience, a being as old as the mountains themselves. They said her hunger was cyclical, like the turning of the seasons. She would sleep for a generation, sometimes longer, and then wake to feed on the livers of children, which was the source of her immortality. Her name, they explained, didn't just mean Sparefinger. It meant she had a sharp finger, a subtle but crucial difference. It was a part of her, not something she carried. They said her heart was her only vulnerability, but she kept it hidden, far from her body, in a stone egg inside a nest at the top of the highest peak. The stories were fantastical, impossible, and yet they fit the facts of my case better than any profile in an FBI textbook. I officially retired last spring. They gave me a plaque and a firm handshake, and I walked away from the only job I'd ever known. But the case didn't retire with me. It followed me home. It sits with me in the quiet of the evening as I look out at the blue haze of the ridgeline. 2 weeks ago, the cycle began again. A family was picnicking near the Oconaluftee River, not 10 miles from where the Beckers lost Sarah. Their 6-year-old son, Daniel, vanished. The details were so chillingly familiar they raised the hair on my arms. He was last seen talking to an elderly woman, a tourist, they thought. She was friendly, had a warm smile, and was wearing a long coat, even though the day was mild. The boy's older sister, who was watching from a distance, told the sheriff's deputy, something that made my blood run cold. She said the old woman gestured for Daniel to come with her, using her left hand. Her right hand remained, the entire time, tucked deep inside her coat pocket. The authorities are treating it as a standard abduction. They're looking for a vehicle, a transient. They are looking for a person. I know better. I know they are looking for a story, a myth that has walked out of the mists of time and is hungry again. I couldn't stay away. I'm an old man now, with a hitch in my step and a tremor in my hands, but I know these woods better than I know the back of my own wrinkled hand. I didn't call the park service. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. This was a personal pilgrimage, a final reckoning. I packed a small bag, my old service revolver, and drove to the Deep Creek trailhead. The forest felt different this time, heavier. Or maybe it was just me. The trail was the same, but the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches like grasping fingers. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I found the place where Sarah's backpack had been left, the spot marked in my memory like a gravestone. From there I pushed through the rhododendron thicket and scrambled up the rise, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and grim resolve. I expected the cabin to be gone, rotted back into the earth from which it came. But it was there. It stood in the clearing, exactly as it had 25 years ago, a dark, silent anomaly against the vibrant green of the forest. It looked untouched by time, preserved in its own pocket of wrongness. And the hole was still in the door, a perfect, dark circle, like a single, unblinking eye staring out at the woods. My hand shook as I pushed the door open. The same sterile, metallic smell hit me. The same sparse room. The same cot with its neatly folded blanket. The same chair and table. But this time, there was something new on the table, placed precisely in the center where the candy wrapper had been. It was a small, blue plastic dinosaur. A toy stegosaurus. The kind you get from a vending machine. A new trophy had been added to the collection. I backed out of the cabin slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The woods were deathly quiet. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered. It was the silence of a predator's lair. As I turned to leave, my eyes caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Standing half, hidden behind the trunk of a massive oak, was a figure. It was an old woman, her hair a wispy white, her back stooped with age. She wore a long, dark coat. She just stood there, watching me with a look that was not a smile, but a placid, terrifying acknowledgement. Her left hand was visible, resting against the bark of the tree. Her right hand was buried deep in her pocket. We stared at each other across the clearing for a long, frozen moment. It wasn't human curiosity in her eyes. It was an ancient, patient intelligence as cold and hard as the river stones that once sat on her windowsill. I did not reach for my gun. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it would be useless. A bullet couldn't kill a story. Then, as slowly as she appeared, she stepped back, melting into the deep shadows of the forest until she was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, my feet rooted to the ground. I didn't find Sarah Becker's body that day, and I know they won't find little Daniel's. Atlanta is not a creature of evidence or remains. She is a creature of emptiness and grief. I am an old man, and I have seen the face of the thing that lives in the heart of these mountains. It is not a monster of tooth and claw. It is the quiet, grandmotherly terror that promises you candy. The patient horror that waits for you to wander, just far enough from the path. The case that haunted me is no longer a case. It is a truth I must live, with some things are not meant to be found, and some stories are true. My name is Liam Carter. If I close my eyes, I can still smell the damp earth and wood smoke of that evening. It's a scent that should be comforting, a reminder of simpler times, of escapes from the city's relentless hum. But for me, it's the smell of the beginning of the end. It's the scent of the moment my world tilted on its axis and showed me the grinning, predatory face of what truly hides in the deep, dark woods. My girlfriend, Chloe, was the one who had pushed for the trip. She had a romantic, almost poetic view of nature, fueled by perfectly curated Instagram feeds of misty mountains and golden hour hikes. We need to disconnect. Liam, she'd said, her eyes shining with an earnestness I couldn't refuse. Just us, the trees, and the stars. A real adventure. So, we'd packed my old sedan with a brand new tent, 2 ridiculously expensive sleeping bags, and enough dried food to survive a small apocalypse. Our destination was Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, a sprawling expanse of the Appalachian Mountains that promised the solitude Chloe craved. I was more of a pragmatist. I loved the idea of the wilderness, but I was also acutely aware of its indifference. Before we left, I spent an hour on 3 different weather apps. The forecast was unanimous clear skies, a gentle breeze, and a low of 55 degrees. Perfect camping weather. No rain. Not a single drop predicted for the next 48 hours. That detail is important. We found our designated campsite late in the afternoon. It was idyllic, almost suspiciously so. A small, flat clearing bordered by a thick wall of ancient-looking hemlocks and rhododendrons, with a well-established fire pit in the center. A shallow, gurgling creek ran along one edge, its sound a constant, soothing murmur. As we set up the tent, the forest seemed to welcome us. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, painting the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow. A woodpecker hammered a rhythmic beat against a distant tree. It was peaceful. It felt safe. By the time dusk began to settle, draping the mountains in shades of purple and deep indigo, we had a respectable fire crackling in the pit. The flames danced and spat, casting a warm, flickering glow on our little bubble of civilization. Chloe was humming a cheerful tune as she arranged our supplies, her face illuminated by the firelight, her usual city-bred anxiety melting away. I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was exactly what we needed. We'd just gotten the fire going strong, the logs settling into a steady, radiant burn, when he walked out of the woods. He didn't emerge from the direction of the trail or the access road. He simply materialized from the impenetrable blackness, between 2 massive oak trees, stepping into the firelight so silently that it was as if the forest itself had birthed him. He wore a ranger's uniform, the khaki shirt, the dark green trousers, the emblematic Smokey Bear hat. But it looked wrong. It was too clean, too crisp, like a costume fresh out of its packaging. The creases in his trousers were sharp enough to cut paper. There wasn't a speck of dust on his polished boots, or a single pine needle clinging to his shirt. No one who spent their days in the wilderness looked that pristine. Then there was his face. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with weathered skin that suggested a life spent outdoors, a stark contradiction to his immaculate uniform. But it was his smile that stopped the air in my lungs. It was wide, fixed, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, which were small, dark, and still like the eyes of a taxidermied animal. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice a smooth, pleasant baritone that felt jarringly out of place with his unsettling appearance. "Just making my rounds. Name's Ranger Thompson." Chloe, ever trusting of authority, immediately relaxed.
"Oh, hello, Ranger,"
she said, her voice bright. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" "It is for now," he replied, his grin never faltering. He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over our campsite, lingering for a moment on the tent, then on Chloe. "But we've had a sudden storm front move in. A nasty one. Wasn't on the forecast. But these mountains, they make their own weather." I felt a prickle of unease. I'd checked 3 different sources. A sudden, unpredicted storm of the magnitude he was implying seemed highly unlikely. He continued, his tone becoming more serious, though the smile remained plastered on his face. "This particular area, right by the creek, is prone to flash floods. The water can rise faster than you can run. It's not safe. I'm evacuating this section of the park for the night." Chloe's face fell. "Oh, no. Really? We just got everything set up." "I know, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience," the ranger said, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "But safety comes first. There's a designated overflow spot up on the ridge. It's higher ground, much safer. It's not as scenic, I'm afraid, but it'll keep you dry and out of harm's way. I can lead you there now." Chloe was already turning towards the tent. "Well, we can't argue with that. Thank you so much for the warning. Ranger, we'll pack up right away." But I didn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The clean uniform, the fixed smile, the phantom storm. It was a puzzle and the pieces didn't fit. "I checked the weather right before we lost service," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "It was supposed to be completely clear all night." Ranger Thompson's gaze shifted to me. The smile didn't change, but his eyes seemed to harden, the stillness within them becoming a flat, cold appraisal. "Like I said, son, the mountains make their own weather. The satellites can't always see what's brewing in these hollers. I've been working these woods for 30 years. I know what I'm talking about." His words were meant to be reassuring, a gentle assertion of experience over technology, but they felt like a threat. Chloe shot me a look, a mixture of annoyance and pleading. "Don't be difficult, Liam." I stood my ground. "I think we'll take our chances," I said, the words feeling heavy and momentous. "We can move the tent further from the creek if we need to. We'll be fine." For the first time, the ranger's smile seemed to tighten at the edges. A flicker of something, annoyance, frustration, passed through his dark eyes before being extinguished. The pleasant mask was back in place. "Switch yourself," he said, his voice losing its feigned warmth, becoming flat and empty. He tipped his hat in a gesture that was almost mocking. "Have a pleasant evening." And then he turned and walked back into the pitch, black woods, the same way he had come. He didn't use a flashlight. He didn't once stumble or hesitate. He just stepped out of the firelight and was instantly swallowed by the darkness. as if he had never been there at all. The silence he left behind was profound and terrifying. The friendly sounds of the forest, the gurgling creek, the chirping crickets, now seemed menacing. What the hell was that, Liam? Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Why did you do that?
He's a ranger.
He was trying to help us. Something wasn't right, Chloe, I said, my own voice barely a croak. His uniform, the weather, him just walking into the dark like that. It wasn't right. We argued for 10 minutes, our hushed, frantic voices a stark intrusion into the heavy silence. Chloe was scared. I was terrified. My bravado had evaporated the moment the man disappeared. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, to twist into unnatural shapes. The fire, our only source of light and comfort, now felt like a beacon, advertising our presence to whatever was watching from the oppressive darkness just beyond its reach. Finally, the fear became too much to bear. We didn't pack. We abandoned everything. The new tent, the expensive sleeping bags, the cooler full of food. We scrambled into the car, locking the doors with fumbling, shaking hands, and we waited. That's when we heard the footsteps. They weren't the sounds of a deer or a bear. They were bipedal, deliberate. A slow, steady crunching of leaves and twigs that began at the edge of the campsite and started to circle. Round and round it went, a patient, predatory patrol. Sometimes it would stop for a minute, and the silence would be even worse. Then, the crunching would start again, always just out of sight, a relentless, terrifying promise in the dark. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, huddled together in the cold front seats of my car, until the first, blessed gray light of sunrise broke through the trees, listening to the footsteps that circled our sight all night long. The transition from night to day was agonizingly slow. The oppressive, absolute blackness of the forest canopy bled into a deep, bruised purple, then a hazy, indifferent gray. With the first true rays of sunlight filtering through the windshield, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't heavy with menace, it was just empty. We had survived the night. Neither of us moved for what felt like an hour. We were frozen, two statues carved from fear, listening to the frantic pounding of our own hearts. My hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Chloe was curled into a tight ball against the passenger door, her face pale and streaked with silent tears. The adrenaline that had kept us wired all night had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that was almost painful. Is it over? Chloe's voice was a fragile whisper, cracking in the cold morning air. I think so, I managed to say, my own voice hoarse. The sun's up, as if the sunlight were a shield. We finally found the courage to move. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I unbuckled my seatbelt and slowly, cautiously, pushed the car door open. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the clean scent of pine and damp earth. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue. There had been no storm. The creek gurgled peacefully, no higher than it had been the evening before. Our campsite was a perfect, undisturbed tableau of our abandoned terror. The tent stood, a silent monument to our interrupted escape. The chairs were still angled toward the fire pit, where a few wisps of smoke curled from the gray ashes. Everything was exactly as we had left it. There were no footprints other than our own, no sign that anyone, real or imagined, had been there at all. For a terrifying second, I questioned my own sanity. Had we imagined it all? a shared delusion brought on by the darkness and the isolation. But then I looked at Chloe's face, at the raw, genuine fear still etched in her eyes, and I knew it was real. The absence of evidence was, in its own way, more terrifying than finding the place torn apart. It spoke of a predator who was careful, methodical, clean. "Leave it," I said, my voice firm. "Leave everything. We're going. Now." There was no argument from Chloe. The romantic allure of the wilderness had been brutally stripped away, revealing the terrifying reality beneath. She just nodded, her eyes wide and fixed on the tree line, as if expecting the man with the fixed grin to step out at any moment. I fumbled with the keys, my hands still shaking, and the engine roared to life, shattering the morning's deceptive peace. The sound felt like a declaration of war against the silence. I didn't bother with a 3-point turn. I slammed the car into reverse, backed onto the narrow dirt trail that served as a road, and sped away without a single glance in the rearview mirror. The drive out was a new kind of hell. The forest, which had seemed so majestic and welcoming just the day before, now felt like a cage. The towering trees pressed in on us, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the car. Every shadow that danced across the road seemed to take on a human form. A fallen log became a body. A rustle in the undergrowth was the sound of pursuit. We were prey, fleeing a hunting ground, and the hunter could be anywhere. We'd been driving for about 15 minutes, the dirt road twisting and turning through the dense woods, when I saw it. Tucked away down a barely, their side path, almost completely obscured by overgrown rhododendron bushes, was the dull glint of metal and glass. It was another car, a dark green SUV, covered in a thick layer of dirt and pollen, its tires half sunk into the soft earth. "Did you see that?" I asked, slowing down. Chloe, who had been staring rigidly ahead, turned to look.
What? Liam, don't stop.
"Please, just keep going." "It's another car," I said, my curiosity overriding my fear for a moment. I pulled over, leaving our own engine running. A terrible, morbid compulsion drew me out. "Stay here. Lock the doors." I walked toward the abandoned vehicle, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air here felt colder, heavier. As I got closer, I could see that the driver's side window was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a single point of impact. The door was slightly ajar. With a deep breath, I pulled it open. The inside was a mess. Papers, maps, and empty water bottles littered the seats and floor. A woman's hiking boot lay on its side on the passenger floor mat. But it was the object on the driver's seat that made my blood run cold. It was a small, leather-bound journal flipped open to the last entry. The handwriting was a neat, looping cursive. "A ranger stopped by." The entry read, "Such a nice man. He warned us about a storm coming and said the lower campsites might flood. He's leading us to a safer spot on the ridge. A bit of a hassle to pack everything up again.
But better safe than sorry.
He seems to know these woods like the back of his hand. He didn't even need a flashlight." I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling violently. I backed away from the car, a wave of nausea washing over me. We weren't the first. This wasn't a random act of harassment. This was a system, a trap, and these people, whoever they were, had walked right into it. They had listened. They had trusted the uniform, trusted the smile. They had followed him into the woods. I ran back to our car, jumped in, and sped away, the tires kicking up a shower of gravel. I didn't say anything to Chloe. I couldn't. The words were lodged in my throat, choked by a fear so profound it felt like I was drowning. It felt like an eternity before we finally hit the paved asphalt of the main park road. The smooth surface beneath the tires was the most reassuring feeling in the world. A few miles later, we saw the sign, Park Headquarters and Ranger Station. It was a sturdy-looking log building with an American flag flying proudly out front. It was a bastion of order and safety in a world that had suddenly become chaotic and predatory. We burst through the doors, looking wild and disheveled. A young, friendly-faced ranger sitting behind a large wooden desk looked up, startled. An older, more grizzled ranger stood by a map on the wall. "Can I help you?" the young one asked. The story came tumbling out of me in a frantic, disjointed rush. I told them everything. Our campsite, the man who called himself Ranger Thompson, the pristine uniform, the fixed grin, the lie about the storm, the footsteps circling us all night. I told them about the abandoned SUV in the journal. As I spoke, the friendly expression on the young ranger's face slowly faded, replaced by one of confusion and concern. He kept glancing at the older ranger, whose back was still to us. When I mentioned the name, Ranger Thompson, the older man finally turned around. His face was grim, his eyes hard. "Describe him," the older ranger said, his voice low and serious. I gave him every detail I could remember. The age, the weathered skin that didn't match the clean uniform, the polished boots, and most of all, the dead, still eyes and the smile that never wavered. The two rangers exchanged a look. It was a glance that was heavy with a shared, unspoken history. It was the look of men who were having their worst fears confirmed. The older ranger leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "Son," he said, and the official, professional tone was gone, replaced by something much graver. "There is no Ranger Thompson working in Pisgah National Forest. There never has been." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The air in the room grew thick and cold. "We've had reports," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Over the last 5 years, 6 people have gone missing from the backcountry in this sector. Officially, the cases are cold. Unrelated incidents, hiker accidents, animal attacks, you know the drill. But unofficially, we've heard whispers, vague descriptions from the occasional spook camper about a helpful ranger who gives them bad directions or an odd warning. Nothing concrete, nothing we could ever act on. Until now." He looked from my face to Chloe's, his expression one of deep, weary sorrow. "You two are the first to describe him in such detail. The first to have a story that corroborates the others. The first to get away." The room fell silent. The weight of that last sentence crashed down on me. We had escaped. We had suited ourselves. And in doing so, we had unknowingly saved our own lives. The footsteps circling our car weren't just a threat. They were the sound of a patient hunter, waiting for his prey to emerge from their shelter. My defiance, my simple refusal to follow him into the dark, had been the only thing that stood between us and becoming another cold case, another whisper in the woods. The words, "the first to get away," hung in the sterile air of the ranger station, heavy and suffocating. They weren't words of congratulations. They were an epitaph for the 6 people who weren't sitting in this room. 6 people who had trusted a uniform and a smile. 6 people who had followed a helpful ranger into the dark without a flashlight. The next few hours were a blur of official procedure, filtered through a haze of trauma. We gave our statements, first separately, then together. The older ranger, whose name was Harding, guided us through it with a grim patience. He had us describe the man again and again, every minute detail, from the impossibly sharp creases in his trousers to the dead, flat stillness in his eyes. He made me pinpoint our campsite on a large topographical map, and then the location where I'd found the abandoned SUV. With each detail I provided, the grim set of his jaw tightened. He knew this story. He had just been missing the final chapters. They offered us coffee, which we accepted but didn't drink. The mugs sat on the table between us, growing cold. Chloe was a ghost. She answered questions in a monotone, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. The vibrant, adventurous woman who had dragged me into the wilderness was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out shell. I wasn't much better. Every time the door to the station opened, my heart would seize, my body tensing for a fight or flight that had already passed. The predator wasn't here, but his shadow stretched all the way from that dark campsite into this brightly lit room. "We'll send a team out." "Of course," Harding said, his voice laced with a wariness that spoke of years spent dealing with the dark side of the wilderness. "We'll retrieve your belongings and dust the SUV for prints. But I have to be honest with you both." He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto mine. "We won't find anything. We never do. This man, this thing, he's a phantom. He leaves no tracks, no evidence. The only thing he leaves behind are missing person posters and stories that sound too crazy to be true." He was right. We knew he was right. The absence of footprints at our own campsite was proof of that. This wasn't just a man. A man makes mistakes. A man leaves traces. This was something else. Something that understood the woods not as a place to live, but as a place to hunt. He used its isolation, its beauty, and its inherent dangers as his tools. The lie about the flash flood wasn't just a lie. It was a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation, preying on the fears of city dwellers who see nature as an unpredictable beast. He didn't need a weapon. Not when he could simply convince his victims to walk willingly to their own slaughter. They told us we were free to go. The drive home was a silent, 4-hour ordeal. The world outside the car seemed alien and distant. Billboards advertising smiling families. Radio jingles about car insurance. The entire mundane tapestry of modern life felt like a film, being played in a language I no longer understood. We had crossed a threshold in that forest, seen something we were never meant to see, and it had severed our connection to the normal world. Chloe and I didn't talk about it. We couldn't. The experience was a chasm that had opened up between us. She would look at me sometimes, and I could see the question in her eyes. "Why did you take me there?" And in my own, I knew she saw the terrible, unspoken answer that haunted my every waking moment. I was the one who said no. I was the one who saved us. It was a truth that should have brought us closer, but instead, it felt like an accusation. My stubbornness, my gut feeling, had been our salvation, and that random twist of fate was too terrible a foundation on which to rebuild a relationship. Sleep offered no escape. For weeks, I would jolt awake in the dead of night, my heart pounding. The image of his fixed, predatory grin burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I'd hear the crunch of leaves outside our apartment window, even though we lived on the 3rd floor. The city, once a symbol of noise and stress, became my sanctuary. The constant hum of traffic, the wail of distant sirens, the light pollution that washed out the stars. These were my new lullabies. They were the sounds of civilization, the sounds of witnesses. Monsters, I learned, prefer the quiet places. Chloe moved out a month later. There was no fight, no dramatic breakup. Just a quiet, sad packing of boxes. "I can't look at you," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "without seeing the woods, without seeing his face." I understood. Looking at her, I saw the ghost of the woman I had failed to protect from a horror she never knew existed. My life since then has been a quiet obsession. I sold my camping gear. I avoid parks and hiking trails. But I can't leave it alone. I spend hours online, scrolling through cold case forums and websites dedicated to the strange and unexplained. I search for keywords: missing, national forest, ranger, and I find them. The whispers Harding spoke of, a post from a man who, 7 years ago, was warned away from a trail in the Shenandoah by a strangely clean ranger, only to read later that a lone hiker had vanished from that same trail on that same day. A comment on a blog from a woman who remembers her father telling a story about a ranger with a weird smile who tried to lead him and his buddy on a cut in the Monongahela National Forest back in the 90s. They declined and later felt they'd had a lucky escape, though they never knew from what. There are no names, no official reports. Just these digital fragments, these echoes of near misses and lucky guesses, scattered across the vast wilderness of the internet. I collect them like a grim hobbyist. I piece them together, creating a map of this phantom's hunting grounds. It stretches for hundreds of miles along the spine of the Appalachians. He is a legend, a campfire story brought to life. A boogeyman who wears the uniform of a protector. I still have the journal I took from the SUV. The police let me keep it after they found no prints on it, not even from the woman who wrote in it. It sits in my bedside table, a cold, leather-bound reminder. Sometimes late at night, I take it out and read that final, cheerful entry. I think about the woman who wrote it, her trust, her relief at being guided to safety. I think about her and the person she was with, walking into the deep woods, following that silent, smiling figure, leaving the firelight behind for a darkness from which they would never return. I am one of the lucky ones, but I carry the forest with me. I can still smell the damp earth and the wood smoke. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my very soul, that he is still out there. He's walking out of the woods, his uniform clean, his grin fixed and wide, telling his story about the coming storm. And somewhere, right now, someone is listening. Someone is packing their tent. Someone is getting ready to follow him. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am a doctoral candidate in the Folklore and Ethnomusicology program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a field that, to the uninitiated, sounds like a quaint and harmless pursuit of dusty old songs and forgotten fairy tales. In many ways, it is. But my specific area of research is less concerned with the quaint and more with the visceral. My dissertation, tentatively titled Echoes in the Hollow, The Transmission and Mutation of Appalachian Murder Ballads, focuses on how these brutal narratives of violence and betrayal have survived, not just as songs, but as living, breathing parts of the cultural memory in the most isolated corners of the mountains. My work is built on the belief that these ballads are more than just lyrics and melodies. They are artifacts of trauma, passed down through generations, They are ghost stories set to music. And there is no ghost more famous, no story more chilling in the Appalachian songbook than that of Pretty Polly. The ballad tells the simple, horrifying tale of Willie, who courts a young girl named Polly, lures her into the woods with promises of marriage, and then murders her, burying her in a shallow grave she was forced to dig herself. For months, I had been tracing its roots, collecting dozens of variations, from the polished, almost sterile versions sung at folk festivals to the raw, mournful renditions hummed by old-timers on their porches. But I was searching for something more, an version, a source. I was looking for the ballad's heart, and my research had led me here, to the deep, winding hollows of Madison County, North Carolina, a place locals still called Bloody Madison, for its violent history during the Civil War and beyond. It was a place where the past, I was told, didn't always stay buried. My methodology was straightforward: immerse, listen, and record. I drove a beat-up Subaru Forester, its cargo space filled not with camping gear for leisure, but with the tools of my trade: a high-fidelity digital audio recorder, a selection of sensitive microphones, notebooks, and a library of historical maps. For 2 weeks, I had been a polite, academic presence in the small towns that dotted the county. I interviewed local historians, spent afternoons in dusty library archives, and drank lukewarm coffee in church basements, always with my recorder ready. I collected some wonderful material. The sinners generous with their time and their heritage. But the versions of Pretty Polly I heard felt rehearsed. They were songs sung for an audience. The sharp edges of the horror sanded down by time and repetition. They were echoes, but the original scream was missing. The breakthrough, or what I hoped was a breakthrough, came from a woman named L.R. Vance. I met her at a small, cluttered general store in a place called Sodom Laurel, a community tucked so far back in the mountains it felt like a wrinkle in the map. Alara was well into her 80s, her face a beautiful, intricate record of a long life, her eyes the color of a stormy sky. She sat on a worn bench out front, shucking beans into a metal bowl, her movements economical and precise. When I introduced myself and my project, she didn't smile. She simply watched me, her gaze unnervingly perceptive, as if she were weighing my purpose and finding it wanting. "Pretty Polly," she said, her voice raspy like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. "Everyone sings that one. The church folks sing it as a warning against wicked men. The boys at the tavern sing it when they're drunk. It's just a song now. I'm looking for the older versions," I explained, trying to sound more like a dedicated scholar and less like a desperate graduate student. The ones that might be closer to the original event the ballad is based on. She let out a short, dry laugh. "The original event wasn't a song, child. It was blood and dirt. It was a girl begging for her life." She paused, fixing me with that intense stare. "You've got all that fancy equipment," she said, nodding toward my car. "You want to record something real. You want to hear the real Pretty Polly." I leaned forward, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "Yes, more than anything. Then you need to stop asking people. You need to go ask the place itself." She gave me a set of directions that were both precise and unnervingly vague. I was to follow the Ivy River north, past an old collapsed tobacco barn, and look for a trail marked only by a trio of birch trees. I was to follow that trail until I reached a sharp bend in the river, a place where the water ran deep and dark, and the banks formed a small, flat clearing. The murder happened there, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. That was Willie's land. He brought her there, and he left her there. The place remembers. If you're quiet, and you go at the right time, it'll sing for you. When is the right time? I asked. A flicker of something I couldn't decipher crossed her face. Pity, perhaps, or a grim sort of amusement. The river knows, she said, and turned back to her beans, the conversation clearly over. My academic mind screamed at me that this was folklore in action, not a literal guide. The old woman was imbuing the landscape with supernatural qualities, a common practice in communities with a strong oral tradition. It was a beautiful, metaphorical way of saying the story was integral to the land itself. It was data, but another part of me, the part that had been drawn to these dark stories, in the first place, was captivated. The pull of the narrative was too strong to ignore. I had to go. The next afternoon, I followed her directions. The paved road gave way to gravel, and the gravel to a rutted dirt track. I found the collapsed barn, its spine broken, looking like the skeleton of some great beast. And there, just beyond it, stood the 3 birch trees, their white bark like pale sentinels at the edge of the woods. I parked the Subaru, loaded my pack with my tent, sleeping bag, and all my recording gear, and stepped onto the trail. The air changed almost immediately. The humidity intensified, and the temperature dropped. The woods were dense, a tangled mesh of rhododendron, and ancient hemlocks that blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The only sounds were the crunch of my own boots on the damp earth, the frantic buzzing of insects, and, in the distance, the growing murmur of the river. The trail was barely there, and I had to push through grasping branches and slick, moss-covered rocks. It felt like the woods were actively trying to discourage me, to turn me back. After an hour that felt like 3, the trees opened up and I found it. The clearing was exactly as Elara had described. It was a small, unnaturally flat patch of ground, no more than 30 feet across, nestled in a sharp, almost theatrical bend of the river. The water here was slow, deep, and the color of black tea. On all sides, the forest pressed in, dark and silent. There was a profound and unsettling stillness to the place. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread by focusing on the task at hand. I worked methodically, setting up my small, 1-person tent. Then I assembled my recording equipment. I placed the main parabolic microphone on a tripod, aiming it toward the riverbank, where the acoustics would be best. I ran a secondary, omnidirectional microphone to the center of the clearing. I checked the levels, formatted the memory card, and ensured the battery pack was full. I was a scientist preparing an experiment. This, I told myself, was field work. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, the atmosphere grew heavier still. The silence deepened, broken only by the river's constant, whispering rush. It didn't sound like water over rocks anymore. It sounded like voices, 1,000 hushed conversations I couldn't quite make out. I made a small, pathetic dinner of a protein bar and an apple, my appetite gone. I sat on a log, my back to the tent, and watched the last of the light fade from the sky, leaving a darkness so complete it felt physical. It swallowed the trees, the river, everything. I was alone, in a place steeped in a story of murder, miles from any road. And I had come here on purpose. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. I retreated into my tent, zipping it tight against the night, But the feeling of being watched, of being an intruder in a place that held a long and patient memory, did not go away. I lay in my sleeping bag, my flashlight in one hand, my ears straining to hear over the beating of my own heart, and waited for the river to sing. Sleep was an impossibility. Lying in the suffocating confines of my sleeping bag, every nerve in my body felt frayed and exposed. The thin nylon walls of the tent offered no real protection. They were merely a psychological barrier, a fragile membrane separating me from the immense, breathing darkness of the Appalachian night. The river was a constant presence. Its murmur, which had seemed merely mysterious from a distance, now sounded explicitly like language. It was a low, ceaseless chorus of whispers, the sound of 1,000 secrets being told simultaneously, just below the threshold of my understanding. I tried to rationalize it, to attribute it to the psychoacoustics of running water, the way the human brain seeks patterns in random noise. It was my mind, I told myself, primed by folklore and isolation, playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being listened to, of being an unwelcome audience to an ancient conversation, was too powerful to be dismissed by academic theory. Hours crawled by. I watched the glowing hands of my watch move with agonizing slowness. 10 o'clock. 11. The moon, if there was one, was completely obscured by the dense canopy and a thick blanket of clouds, leaving the world outside my tent in a state of absolute, primal blackness. My flashlight, resting by my side, felt like a talisman, its potential to cut through the dark the only comfort I had. I had turned off the recording equipment to conserve the battery, a decision that now seemed foolish. What if the place had already begun to sing and I had missed it? The thought was a cocktail of professional anxiety and a deeper, more unsettling fear. It was just after midnight when the character of the night changed. The indistinct murmur of the river didn't stop, but another sound rose through it, separate and terrifyingly clear. It was a voice, a young woman's voice, thin and laced with a desperate, pleading terror. It wasn't singing, it was begging. The words were fragmented, snatched away by the breeze and the sound of the water, but the emotion was unmistakable. Please, Willie, don't. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, focused silence that seemed to fall around the voice. This wasn't my imagination. This was not the river. It was a human sound, raw and immediate, and it was coming from somewhere outside nearby. Before I could process the sheer impossibility of it, a second voice answered. It was a man's, a low, guttural rumble, devoid of any warmth or compassion. His words were as indistinct as hers, a furious, angry muttering. But the menace in his tone was a physical thing. It felt like a pressure against the thin walls of the tent, a wave of pure, cold malice. A war raged within me. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to stay put, to press myself into the earth, and not make a sound, to wait for the sun. This was a place with a history of violence, and the sounds I was hearing were not of the past. They felt terrifyingly present. Maybe it wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was something worse. A crime being committed, right now, just yards from where I lay hidden. But the folklorist in me, the scholar who had chased this story for months, was screaming just as loudly. This was it. This was what Elara Vance had promised. This was the real Pretty Polly. It wasn't a song. It was blood and dirt. It was a girl begging for her life. My academic curiosity, a force more powerful and reckless than I had ever realized. one out. My hands shaking so badly, I could barely work the zipper. I fumbled for the main power switch on my recording deck. The small red light blinked on, a tiny, defiant star in the darkness of my tent. I grabbed my largest flashlight, a heavy, duty mag light that could throw a beam 100 yards, and took a deep, shuddering breath. I slowly, quietly, unzipped the tent flap. The night air that hit my face was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The voices were louder out here, clearer. The woman was sobbing now, a heartbreaking sound of utter despair. The man's voice was a low, constant growl. They seemed to be coming from downstream, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Clutching the flashlight like a weapon, I crept out of the tent. I flicked it on, and the powerful beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating a world of stark, terrifying contrasts. The familiar trees became monstrous shapes, their branches like grasping arms. Every shadow seemed to writhe and twist at the edge of the light. I moved slowly, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid snapping a twig or dislodging a stone. The voices were my beacon, drawing me forward. They led me away from the relative safety of the clearing, toward a dense thicket of rhododendron that grew right up to the riverbank. As I got closer, I could start to make out words. "For God's sake," the woman wept. The man's reply was a snarl. "God ain't listening out here." My flashlight beam pushed through the last of the leaves, and I saw it. Or rather, I saw the absence of it. In a small, hollowed-out space at the foot of an ancient oak, the ground was disturbed. The earth was dark and freshly turned, piled in a mound to one side. It was a depression in the ground, long and narrow. A perfect rectangle. It was a grave. A shallow, empty grave, dug with a brutal, urgent haste. And there was no one there. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth, my heart pounding in my ears. The clearing was empty. The woods were still. The voices, both of them, had vanished. The instant my light had fallen upon the open grave, they had been extinguished, as if a switch had been thrown. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was profound and absolute. It was a dead silence, heavier and more terrifying than the whispers and the pleading had ever been. I was alone, standing in the dead of night, in the heart of a haunted wood, staring at a freshly dug grave. My mind reeled, trying to find a rational foothold. A prank. Had someone known I was coming? Had Alara set me up? But that made no sense. The sheer effort, the perfect timing, the raw, authentic terror in that voice. It wasn't a performance. My gaze fell to the digital recorder, still clutched in my left hand. The red light was still on. It had been running the entire time. With trembling fingers, I switched off the main power, unplugged my headphones from the jack, and plugged them in. My hands were so slick with sweat, I could barely handle the small buttons. I rewound the recording to the point where I had left the tent. I took a shaky breath, pressed the headphones tight against my ears, and hit play. The sound of my own fumbling with the zipper was loud and jarring. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. I could hear the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. But the voices, the pleading, the angry muttering, they weren't there. There was no argument. There was no begging. Instead, there was something else. A voice began to sing. It was a woman's voice, impossibly clear and pure, emerging from the static of the night. It was unaccompanied, filled with an ancient, heartbreaking sorrow. The audio quality was perfect, as if it had been recorded in a professional studio. completely isolated from the ambient sounds of the river and the woods that I knew had been there. The voice, achingly beautiful, began the story. "Polly, pretty Polly, come go along with me." I sank to my knees, the flashlight dropping from my hand and casting a wild, bouncing light across the scene. I was listening to the ballad, the complete ballad of Pretty Polly, sung from beginning to end. It was a version I had never heard before, filled with verses of such intimate detail and raw pain that they felt less like a story and more like a testimony. The melody twisted in unfamiliar, mournful ways. It was the version, the source. The song continued, its narrative unfolding in my ears while my eyes remained fixed on the empty grave before me. The voice sang of Willie's promises, of their journey into the woods, of Polly's growing fear. It sang of the knife, the betrayal, the coldness in his eyes. Then, the song reached its final, terrible climax, the verse where Willie forces Polly to dig her own grave. The ghostly, beautiful voice on the recording sang. She dug her own grave with a trembling hand. I stared at the dark, disturbed earth, the hole in the world waiting to be filled. The air grew impossibly cold. The voice in my headphones, clear as a bell, sang a final line, a line that exists in no recorded version, no printed collection, no folklorist archive. A line I had never heard, but a line I knew, with a certainty that froze the marrow in my bones, was the absolute truth. "He's digging my grave," the voice sang, its sorrow turning to a chilling, final realization, and I see it now. The recording ended. There was only the hiss of empty tape. The story was over, and I was left in the crushing, watchful silence, kneeling before the evidence. For a long time, I couldn't move. I remained kneeling on the damp earth, the headphones silent against my ears, the world reduced to the pale, trembling circle of my flashlight's beam on the dark soil of the empty grave. The silence that followed the recording was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from dread and the chilling finality of what I had just heard. The story was over, but the horror was just beginning. My academic mind, the part of me that had driven this entire insane expedition, was reeling. I had done it. I had captured something impossible, a piece of evidence that would rewrite the conventions of my field. It was the discovery of a lifetime. But the human part of me, the part that was a lone woman in a dark wood miles from help, knew only one thing. I was kneeling at a grave that had been prepared tonight, and I was in the presence of the man who had dug it. A branch snapped in the woods behind me. The sound, so common and natural, was now a gunshot in the dead silence. It jolted me from my paralysis into a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled panic. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. Scrambling backward, I snatched the flashlight, my fingers fumbling over the cold metal. The beam danced wildly, cutting frantic, useless arcs through the oppressive darkness. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on me from the impenetrable wall of trees. The whispers of the river had returned, but now they sounded different, mocking, hungry. The place was no longer just watchful, it was waiting. My camp was 100 yards away, but it might as well have been 100 miles. I turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, heedless of the branches that whipped my face and tore at my clothes. My only thought was the fragile sanctuary of my tent and the car beyond it. The sounds of my own frantic flight were deafening. My ragged gasps for air, the pounding of my feet, the frantic thumping of my own heart. But beneath it all, I could hear another sound, a slow, heavy, deliberate tread, keeping pace with me from just beyond the edge of my light. I didn't look back. I knew, with a certainty that was absolute and soul-destroying, that if I turned my head, I would see him. Willie. His face indistinct in the gloom, his hands stained with fresh earth. I burst back into the clearing, a sob of relief escaping my lips as I saw the faint, silvery outline of my tent. I didn't slow down. I ripped through the zipper, threw myself inside, and collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking uncontrollably. My precious recording equipment lay scattered, where I had left it. I began to cram it into its padded cases with clumsy, terrified hands, my only goal to pack and leave. The parabolic microphone, the tripod, the cables. I shoved them all into my pack, not caring if they broke. The recording was the only thing that mattered. The small digital deck was my proof, my trophy, and my curse. I clutched it to my chest like a holy relic. Packing the tent was an ordeal. Every rustle of the nylon, every clink of the poles, sounded like an invitation. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it was a physical pressure on my skin. I kept the flashlight beam sweeping the perimeter of the clearing, half, expecting to see a figure emerge from the trees at any moment. The slow, heavy footfalls had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. It was the silence of a predator that has cornered its prey and knows it has all the time in the world. Finally, with the tent and sleeping bag haphazardly stuffed into their sacks, I shouldered my pack and began the long walk back to the car. The trail that had been merely difficult on the way in was now a gauntlet of terror. Every gnarled root looked like a grasping hand. Every shadow held a waiting figure. The air was thick with a silent, malevolent energy. The forest was no longer neutral, it was his accomplice. I imagined Polly's final walk along this same path, her hope dwindling with every step, the man she trusted leading her to her doom. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The past wasn't just repeating. It was reaching out for me, trying to pull me into its narrative. When I finally saw the familiar shape of my Subaru through the trees, I almost wept with relief. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking too much to fit the key in the lock. A low laugh seemed to echo from the woods behind me, a sound of pure, triumphant evil. I finally wrenched the door open, threw my pack onto the passenger seat, and scrambled inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. I didn't wait. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine turned over with a roar that felt like the most beautiful sound in the world. I slammed the car into gear and sped away, spraying gravel as I fishtailed onto the dirt track, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, and the headlights were cutting through the familiar asphalt of the main road. I drove for an hour, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, before I felt safe enough to pull into the brightly lit parking lot of an all-night gas station. I sat there for a long time, the engine running, the car's interior light, a pathetic shield as the memory of the profound darkness I had just escaped. My body still trembled with leftover adrenaline. I looked at the digital recorder on the seat beside me. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. Back in the sterile anonymity of my motel room, I locked the door, wedged a chair under the knob, and drew the curtains tight. With the lights on and the television murmuring for background noise, I allowed myself to listen to the recording again. I plugged in my headphones, my heart pounding, and pressed play. A ghostly, beautiful voice filled my ears once more, telling its terrible story. And that final, chilling line, delivered with the dawning horror of absolute certainty. His digging my grave, and I see it now. It was all there. I had captured a ghost on tape. The next day, I drove back to Sodom Laurel. I had to see Alara Vance. I found her in the same spot. On the bench outside the general store, a basket of apples in her lap. She looked up as I approached, and her stormy eyes held no surprise. It was as if she had been waiting for me. "You went," she said. It wasn't a question. I went. I confirmed, my voice hoarse. I heard them, and I recorded it. She nodded slowly, her gaze distant, fixed on the mountains that loomed over the town. "The place remembers," she said softly. "It holds the story. The pain of it stains the ground. It wasn't just a memory," I said, my voice trembling. "It was happening. I saw the grave. And the recorder, it didn't pick up the argument I heard. It picked up her song. The whole ballad. A flicker of something that looked like pity crossed her ancient face. The place doesn't just remember, child. It tries to finish the story. It replays the murder again and again, hoping for a different ending. But Willie's there too. His hate is as strong as her sorrow. He's always there, digging that grave." She finally turned her gaze to meet mine, and her eyes were filled with a terrible, ancient wisdom. "He's not just digging it for her anymore. The place gets hungry. It looks for new players. It sets the stage, hoping someone will walk onto it." A cold dread, colder than anything I had felt in the woods, washed over me. The pleading voice, the angry muttering, the freshly dug grave. It wasn't a residual haunting. It was a trap. I whispered, the realization dawning. It wasn't for her. "No," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was for you." I left Madison County that day and never went back. My dissertation was a triumph. I titled it The Polyresonance: Acoustic Phenomena and Traumatic Memory in Appalachian Folklore. I never used the word ghost. I didn't have to. The recording spoke for itself. It made my career. But it also broke me. I can no longer listen to folk music. I can't stand the silence of a quiet room. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up with the phantom feeling of damp earth on my hands. I have my proof, my perfect, impossible data. But I know what Alara knew. Some stories aren't meant to be collected. They are living things. And the ghost of Pretty Polly isn't the only one that followed me out of that hollow. Willie's ghost followed me, too. I have the girl's song on my recorder, but I have the man's silence in my soul. And I know, with a certainty that haunts my every waking moment, that he is still out there, listening and waiting for the story to begin again.